Ladies and gentlemen, it is now time. It is time. Nope. It's time for World Discussion with Agent Smith. You have questions and concerns about the news? Now's the time. You may ask about them if you desire. Or you can just hang out. I will continue to play StarCraft 2 during this time, but I'll be focusing primarily on the conversation. Hello?
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 Hey, how are you?
Pretty good.
Glad to hear it. Did you have a good week?
Yeah, pretty solid overall. Prepping to host a friend who also streams, and he's moving to the area. He'll be like 2.5 miles from me, so I can hop, skip, and jump over there.
Oh, cool.
What about you?
Oh, just kind of tired.
Mm-hmm.
Had to do a lot of late nights, helping out around the house. Sleep is pretty important, unfortunately.
It's true. But there's always another reason to stay awake longer.
But it were otherwise. Whew. I got a lot of engagement on that last YouTube video, didn't we?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if we get them out fast, then the information is a lot more relevant. And we've also been fairly consistent recently getting the Agent Smith time going, so.
Yeah. Zencaster's still not working?
I haven't tried it. The YouTube stuff is a faster turnaround. If we do Zencaster, then it needs to go to an audio editor, and they mess with our levels and that kind of stuff. But with this one, we just talk the words and mark it, and then Cobra X comes in and he just marks the start and the end, and then we ship it.
Gotcha. Well, what did you want to do today?
So the main headline that I saw was the election in India and how I think the establishment candidate got defeated convincingly.
I don't think so. Well, you're talking about West Bengal, right?
Modi, I think?
Well, he's still in power.
But
he didn't...
Did he lose the vote?
Well, I mean, if we're talking about West Bengal, then his party lost. But there was no national election recently that I'm aware of. It was purely a local election in the state of West Bengal.
Yeah, okay, here's what it says. India's Prime Minister Modi has suffered a rare political defeat in a key state election in West Bengal.
Okay.
So I guess his expansive power is somewhat diminished, but still doing things and stuff. He's not
a little bit
elected out, yeah.
A little bit, but not quite as much as you might think. It's not the case that his party was in power and was defeated. They were actually already the opposition in West Bengal. But they created a new coalition that they were hoping would be able to successfully challenge the established government. I think it was Trinamool Conference, something like that. Some funky name. Trinamool Party. All India Trinamool Party. I think that's it. Yeah, West Bengal. So they've been in power in West Bengal for, I think, more than a decade, if I'm not mistaken. And the BJP, which is Modi's party, kind of got together with some of the other opposition parties and made a go of it in the recent election. And it was considered kind of a litmus test for Modi's popularity, sort of in India writ large. And as you can see, it didn't really go according to plan for them. But he's not necessarily weaker for it. He hasn't really lost anything per se. You know, in so much as it was a loss, it was more of a loss of momentum, because the BJP had been doing pretty well picking up state governments over the past 5 years or so. So this kind of breaks the trend a little bit.
I see. So the headline could have read something more like he didn't gain more power, but is still pretty much where he's
Yeah.
been.
Yeah,
Gotcha.
that would be more accurate, probably.
Man, you really have to watch out for headlines. The way that they frame stuff can get you to have the complete opposite perspective of what happened. If you just read it quickly and then move on, as I just demonstrated for the class.
Well, I mean, it's hard to jam a lot of information in a headline's worth of words, so I can't entirely blame them. But some of them do go out of their way to be incendiary, shall we say.
Yeah, you gotta get those clicks.
Yeah, that was something I noticed on Foreign Policy Mag a long time ago, back when I was still reading that pretty regularly. I noticed that there was kind of a disconnect between the headlines for articles and the content. You know, the headlines would generally be as incendiary as possible, but then when you read the actual article, it was actually pretty chill.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes radically different from what the headline was implying. And what I found out from that is that article authors do not write the headlines for their articles. That's actually done by the publication that is publishing the article. So that's not the author's fault. That's the fault of editors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Modi's still doing pretty strong in general, and the BJP as well. It's their credibility is kind of undermined, right, because of the COVID stuff going on right now in India. Obviously, they're having a lot of trouble with that. You know, I think that's made the news pretty much everywhere by this point. But that's not necessarily going to be a deal breaker for them, sort of in the medium term. Obviously, it didn't work out in West Bengal, but to be fair, there's more to West Bengal than just the BJP and COVID. You know, West Bengal politics, like every state, like the politics in every state in India, is largely driven by domestic local factors. You know, so the local leader of the Trinamool Congress in West Bengal is pretty popular in the state, even after 10 some years in power, and after a number of scandals having to do with maybe not abuses of power per se, but maybe very aggressive electioneering of one sort or another, which they've been accused of, rightfully so, as it were.
Electioneering would be what exactly?
Maybe I'm not using the word right, but basically they very aggressively will attack the campaigns of other candidates. And when I say attack, I don't mean like attack ads. I mean they'll have people physically on the street, assaulting or assailing people of different political parties. And there's also a lot of corruption. There's a lot of basically local officials in the party will require you, if you want to do business, to basically do people who are connected with the party. Basically that's just an old story of political connections. So that's kind of dented their popularity over the past 10 years. And unfortunately for them, that created the space for the BJP to kind of make the push that they made in this recent election, as close as it was. But again, the leader of the party has actually not really been tainted by those issues. She's still very popular. And I don't think that's that unusual in India. A lot of regional political parties in India tend to do that, where they have the party kind of get in trouble occasionally, but generally do well, so long as the leader is popular. And generally the parties themselves are driven by personality rather than politics. In the south of India, I think specifically in Tamil Nadu, the two largest political parties are led by former celebrities. So it's more about the name and the personality than it is about, wanting more government or less government, or sort of the policy-based debates that we kind of have over here. So West Bengal politics aren't any different in that regard. I don't think the leader of the Trinamool Congress is a former celebrity, though, to be fair to her. I think she's an activist. She was an activist, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, she's doing pretty well. Sitting pretty, as it were. We'll see how long it lasts. You never know what can happen. But for now, the BJP is on the outs in West Bengal. But they'll probably do well elsewhere. Their popularity hasn't really been dented too much by COVID, at least for the moment. They'll take a hit for sure, but they've got plenty of other issues that they can run on, and they'll probably run on those pretty successfully. The Kashmir thing was very popular amongst the base for the BJP, and there's been a number of economic reforms that they've attempted to varying degrees to implement. Some of those have damaged their supporters, but they still really like the party. So even though it kind of hurt them financially, they're still backing them. So they're doing pretty well in terms of spin, as it were. I think we talked a little bit last time about how the BJP kind of revolutionized the use of the internet and social media in Indian politics. And so one of the manifestations of that is that policy implementations that kind of ended up hurting their core supporters ended up not really undermining their support for the party because they are so dedicated to it. Also, their popularity kind of comes down to some structural factors in Indian politics, like the sort of rise of religious politics and the rise of Indian nationalism. Those two factors have really kind of driven the growth of their constituency. So in that sense, it kind of doesn't matter what they do, so long as those factors continue to be the dominant defining characteristics in Indian politics, they'll probably still do pretty well unless they just grievously screw something up.
And Hinduism would be the dominant religious bloc?
Yeah. Yeah, Hinduism. Which is kind of weird because Hinduism is not it's not like a hierarchical unified religion like Islam or Christianity. There is no Pope of Hinduism. There is no Church of Hinduism. Hinduism is kind of a catch-all term that refers to a whole slew of different indigenous religious traditions in South Asia. And that being the case, it's very, very decentralized. So it's a little weird to have that be sort of the crux of politics. So I think the fact that religion has emerged as a political sort of wedge issue has more to do with nationalism than it does with rising religious belief or faith. I think nationalists are defining their national identity partly in terms of their affinity for local religious institutions. So in that sense, Hinduism is not so much a religious institution that people want to vest more power in. It's more of an identity that nationalists are embracing more as part of their identity.
That sounds fairly similar to Protestantism, though, because Protestant churches don't have one leader over all of them like the Pope does for Catholicism. It's more of your local denomination, and sometimes within a denomination there's some like leadership of multiple states, but there's no kind of one authority on Christianity. So it does sound fairly similar, where Christianity for Protestants is more of an identity than it is that you're beholden to some administration within the Christian church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right. It's much more similar to Protestantism in that regard, but there's still differences in so much as different Protestant denominations do have their own institutions, like Episcopalians, not so much Congregationalists, and then there's the other one was sort of like the in-between one, Presbyterians.
Presbyterians, Lutherans, Baptists.
Well, from what I was reading, Presbyterian, it actually refers to the institutional organization of the church. I think it's also its own denomination, but I think the original word referred to like how they organized the church. So like Episcopalian refers to the Church of England, and that's very hierarchical. That's basically like almost a Protestant equivalent of the Catholic Church. And then Presbyterian is like less centralized. It embraces much more a decentralized structure, but it still has a hierarchy. And then there's the Congregationalists, which are almost completely decentralized. In that case, the institutions are almost all locally controlled, and there's just like a very loose association at the top. So there is some institutionalization there. With Hinduism, they don't really have that. You know, again, it's just a catch-all term. You know, if you wanted to find a more direct equivalent with Protestants, you could find them, but you would have to look at like individual, basically sampradayas. You know, basically the tradition. You know, the traditional intellectual lineages that have often their own individual institutions. Some of them have sort of monk-like, what would you call it, monasteries. Some of them have monastic institutions, and some are more decentralized than that. You know, there's a whole plethora of different like religious institutions in India that fall under the rubric of Hinduism. And you're right that the whole thing is very decentralized, but like the individual institutions have more or less similarity with Protestantism, depending. So in general, you're right, but I would just add that caveat because, I don't know, I'm a nitpicker, I guess. That just set off a red flag for me. I just felt compelled to make the distinction, I guess. But yeah, I mean, even in the case of the United States, I mean, if you look at religious nationalists, how many of them are like regular churchgoers? You know, it's probably a relatively limited number. You know, you can definitely find them. But I think there's a difference between people who vote according to their faith and people who vote according to their national identity and just happen to include their faith as part of that national identity. You know, for the former group, I would expect them to be regular churchgoers. But for the latter group, it's more just a sticker they have on their bumper, more so than something that they actually observe religiously. And that latter group more defines Indian nationalism at this point and the direction they're going. What else was going on in India? I think COVID has kind of dominated their headlines for the most part. So that's kind of the defining story right now. There's a lot of stuff going on with vaccines in India, but that's not really political per se. It just has to do with the demand crush. You know, India is the world's leading producer of vaccines. So there's obviously a huge surge in demand. So they're having logistical issues just stemming from that.
Do they produce more than they use?
Interesting question. Kind of. If they stopped all exports, they would probably have more. Well, they would definitely have more. And their vaccine program is underperforming a little bit. You know, they are kind of running behind schedule, and they could do to have more vaccines. But for the most part, they've still been exporting them. So yes, they are producing more than they consume, but that's mostly because they're honoring the contracts that they had from last year. Indian government could step in and change that if they wanted to, but for now they're not. Yeah, I think we had a commenter on that, kind of in that vein, on YouTube. There was somebody who was pointing out that, I guess I could just talk about this now because this was one of the corrections that I had. You know, last time we talked about how the vaccine program in the United States and the United Kingdom had been the strongest in the world thus far. And I kind of talked about that more in terms of, I guess, the industrial base here. How we were kind of better at that because we had better logistics and better production. But the other side of that story, as this person on YouTube pointed out, is that the United States government, and I guess also the UK government, I'm a little more skeptical of that though, but certainly the US government has gone out of its way to try to direct vaccine production towards the US market. That was one of the conditions of Operation Warp Speed, which was a program implemented under the Trump administration in 2020 that was designed to accelerate the development and production and distribution of vaccines in the United States. And one of the conditions of participation in the program is that producers had to prioritize the US market over other markets. And I think also the Biden administration this year has been using the Defense Production Act in order to direct more, basically as a quid pro quo. I mean, the industry gets more resources that they want and need, but in exchange, the government is directing them to prioritize US buyers over foreign buyers. So certainly the US has been pushing consumption in its own market to the detriment of the rest of the world. The UK may also be doing that, but I haven't read as much about that. I'm a little skeptical there because the European Union has political incentive to kind of distort that. There's been a lot of complaints in Europe about how the vaccine program there is running behind schedule, and some of the blame has fallen on the United Kingdom because there's the vaccine production supply chain in Europe is sort of distributed, so some of it's in the UK, and I think some of it is in Germany and Belgium, if I'm remembering correctly. And the factory in the United Kingdom has not been sending much, if any, in terms of vaccines to the European market. And the vaccine producer in the UK has justified that by saying that the contract that the European Union signed with them kind of gave them wiggle room to prioritize other buyers if they needed to. So they're kind of exercising that clause of the contract in order to divert vaccines away from Europe. So obviously the European Union doesn't like that. And they think that the producer in question is kind of abusing the contract in question, basically saying that they actually should be prioritizing Europe and that it's illegal for them not to. And they filed a lawsuit to that effect. I don't think it's going to go anywhere because I think the European Union basically just wants to avoid political pressure stemming from the slow pace of the vaccine rollout over there. There was a lot of pressure to perform in 2020 in terms of acquiring vaccines. And the European Union, from what I was reading, kind of dragged its feet a little bit because they were trying to do everything by the letter, basically, bureaucratically speaking. I can't remember specifically what it was that they were worried about. I think it had something to do with maybe focusing on making sure that everything was kosher in terms of safety. I would have to look at my notes, but I don't have them in front of me here. But there was some specific bureaucratic reason they had for kind of going slower in terms of drawing up the contract. Oh, you know what? I think it was price, actually, now that I think about it. I think they were trying to go through the normal procurement process for any large government acquisition. So they were trying to negotiate a better price for all of the member states in the European Union. But that process kind of extended the negotiation to sign the contract by a couple months, if I remember correctly. So because they did that, they ended up not really getting priority as compared to some of the other countries that signed contracts earlier than them. That's what I remember reading. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert on it, but that was my impression anyway. I would also add just another note on that. I think the YouTube commenter that I'm referring to also mentioned that there wasn't any reason for, I think he actually used Europe twice when he meant to say England, when he meant to say Europe to England. That's what I'm assuming anyway. But he was saying that there wasn't any reason that vaccines going from Germany to the UK should have any harder a time because of Brexit than vaccines going from England to Germany. And that's not actually true. Actually, it is much easier for vaccines to go from Germany to the UK than vice versa. And that's just because, well, let me make sure I'm getting that right. Yeah, that's right. So what it was is that the United Kingdom has not actually implemented tariffs and other border checks on its border like it said it would as part of the Brexit agreement. In contrast, Europe has. So if you're selling stuff in England to somebody in Europe, you're going to have a lot of trouble, and you've been having a lot of trouble navigating all of the bureaucracy corresponding to health certificates, tariffs, VAT, just all that stuff. But the United Kingdom has not implemented the same regime. They say that they will, and they're just delaying it right now because they basically weren't ready. Again, to kind of refer back to the discussions we've had on Brexit, Brexit happened very quickly. I know that sounds strange since it's been kind of unfolding over the course of 4 years, but normally something that big and all-encompassing would take much longer to negotiate and prepare for. So the British government just wasn't prepared after the deal was signed, and so they've basically been delaying it. So the trading relationship between Europe and the UK is actually weirdly asymmetrical right now. Basically, there are border checks and trade restrictions for British sellers trying to sell to Europeans, but not for Europeans selling to British buyers. So for that reason, it's actually much easier for vaccines to go from Europe to England, and much harder for vaccines to go from England to Europe, at least as far as Brexit. So that would be my nitpick as far as the YouTube comment. Everything else they said was right, though. Yeah, they are right that there has been shenanigans as far as the UK and the US kind of inhibiting the export of vaccines to their own benefit and to everybody else's detriment. That's affected India too, because there's and I've actually got the notes for that too somewhere. One of the ingredients to the RNA vaccines that are being produced is this weird substance. I don't know the science behind it, so I just call it goo. It's basically this fancy goo that's produced here in the United States. It might be produced in Europe too, but certainly it's produced in the United States. And because the government used the Defense Production Act, that company in the United States that produces the goo has to prioritize American vaccine producers when they put in an order to buy the stuff. And the result of that is that Indian vaccine producers are facing a shortage of that goo. Again, whatever it is. And they've been asking the US government, specifically the Biden administration, to ease restrictions on sales to foreign buyers so that they can ramp up vaccine production more. Don't think the Biden administration is going to do that, at least not for the next couple months. But there has been talk of releasing some reserves of vaccines in the US. I think we talked about that a little bit last time, too. I think I underestimated the number of vaccines they were willing to part with. I think I read a quote saying it would be something like tens of millions of vaccine doses that the US would release from its reserve to India. But I don't think that they're going to ease the supply restrictions, at least as far as the Defense Production Act is at least as far as the Defense Production Act activation goes. My suspicion is that the US government is going to prioritize vaccination in the United States for the next couple months until some critical mass of vaccinations takes place, and then they're going to start exporting in mass. I've been reading some talk about the United States purposely going out of its way to try to help vaccinate the rest of the world, and maybe subsidizing production to that effect. I don't know if anything will come of that, but I think that just illustrates just how much the United States wants to focus on the US first. I think that's partly done just to kind of diffuse populist political pressure. There's obviously been a kind of a big upsurge of populism in the United States and other countries, and, well, everywhere pretty much over the past 10 years. And I think the Biden administration is pretty sensitive to that and wants to focus on the United States in order to kind of diffuse any potential criticism that they're putting other countries before the US market. So long story short, India is kind of hurting from that. But to their credit, India is still exporting vaccines while at the same time consuming them. So that's a really long-winded answer to your question, Neuro, about whether or not they consume more than they export.
Mm-hmm. Well, they're cranking them out. One thing that's important to consider whenever we're talking about a place like India or China is the population is massive. It's over 1 billion.
Mm-hmm.
So their problems are going to look different from the problems of a small European country, for example.
Yeah, scale definitely has an effect. And in India's case, they're definitely feeling that right now. It's just too many people for the government to really kind of govern particularly effectively. And so, yeah, COVID is kind of doing its damage as a result. There's other factors at work there too. Some of it is just political. The Modi administration has kind of downplayed COVID a little bit. They've taken relatively strong measures against it for a government that's kind of downplayed it, but they still do that. And they've still made lots of exemptions for religion. We talked about that last time too. There was that big Hindu festival that they didn't cancel. And as a result, that probably has made things worse.
So that's India. Anything else that's been happening that's big?
The nuclear talks are ongoing. So there was a few updates there if you wanted to get into that.
Sure.
Take a look at that. Skip that for now. Yeah, so they're still not really close to a final agreement, but from what I was reading, the Biden administration may prioritize getting a deal pretty strongly. And if that's the case, that's probably going to mean some concessions on the part of the United States. I was reading that the Biden administration may want to try to just get it out of the way so that it doesn't take up political bandwidth in the administration. So if that's the case, then they're not going to be as concerned with potential Iranian cheating or ballistic missile development or what have you as they are with just purely the nuclear development. So that being the case, they'll probably just focus pretty narrowly on that. Let's see, from what I have in my notes here, the U.S. said that it was pretty open to sanctions relief, specifically on Iran's central bank and certain key economic sectors. Let's see. But there's two hang-ups right now. One of them is that the Trump administration designated the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, I think that should be Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, as a terrorist organization. And that's something that the Iranians are not very happy with. So one of their demands in the talks is that that designation be removed. I think that was the main one from what I was seeing. So the Iranians want sanctions relief and the IRGC to not be labeled a terrorist organization. Let's see. The United States, for its part, basically just wants a return to the deal, from what I remembered. I think the U.S. Oh yeah, the U.S. did signal that it's willing to lift sanctions in less than a year. That's important because part of the original nuclear deal is that sanctions relief was staggered. So it's not like they relieved all of the sanctions all at once. They kind of relieved them in stages. And so if the United States is willing to do a lot of sanctions relief much quicker, that would itself represent a concession. So the Iranian government will probably like that. See, I think that pretty much are the main ones. Some of the sectors that they were thinking of sanctions relief included finance and oil, which shouldn't surprise anybody. Again, they specifically mentioned their central bank as an institution that they wanted to see sanctions relief for. So having broader sanctions relief for the financial sector just kind of ties into that. So having more liquidity in the Iranian market will help Iranian business and will also help out the Iranian government since they would have more access to capital. And then the oil industry kind of speaks for itself. Obviously, Iran is a major oil producer, so they want sanctions relief there so that they can start getting significant revenue again. So all told, signs thus far are relatively positive. If the United States is willing to make concessions, and it seems they are, then we'll probably get a deal within the next couple months. I would add that there's pressure to get a deal also in the next couple months because there's an election in Iran coming up, and it's expected that hardliners are going to do pretty well. And if that's the case, then it's going to be much harder to get a deal done with that government, with the potential next government, than it will be with the current government. So both the current government in Iran, which itself wants a deal because it's more of a reformist government, and the United States are probably going to push pretty hard to get it done. So kind of a confluence of political factors there. So just a short update there as far as the Iranian nuclear talks. There's been some other drama in Iran as far as some leaked audio, but that doesn't have to do with nuclear talks per se. And I don't know that it has broader implications, really. It just kind of says something about the distribution of power within Iranian politics. So I'll just kind of skip that for now.
Seems like a pretty big leak then.
In terms of the talks?
No, not in terms of the talks, but in terms of whatever that's about.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, a pretty big leak.
Yeah.
I thought you said leap.
Oh, no.
My mistake. Yeah, it was basically just the foreign minister making some comments to an oral history project, apparently. The audio from that got leaked, and he was just kind of heard complaining, basically, about how he didn't really have as much influence on Iranian foreign policy as the IRGC does, which isn't all that controversial, really, if you know about Iranian politics. I mean, everybody kind of knows that, but you're not really supposed to talk about it, per se. It's certainly a little jarring coming from a high-level official. And then there was some other stuff about Russia. You know, he's kind of complaining about how Russia has been working with the IRGC in order to kind of, influence the broader region, basically. But he just kind of lamented his lack of control over foreign policy stemming from the IRGC's influence and Russian influence. So there's kind of more to that. I've got the details here, but that's the gist of it. I think one of the, I guess since we're talking about the nuclear talks, one of the things that came out of the leak was that he alleged that Russia had not wanted the nuclear talks to succeed, and that they'd actively tried to undermine them by coordinating with the IRGC. Specifically, he mentioned that the Russians wanted the Iranians to commit more to Syria, and they apparently thought that having the Iranians in Syria would undermine the talks somehow. That wasn't really specified in the article I read, but that was the allegation anyway made by the foreign minister. It could be worth pointing out here that sometimes leaks are not actually leaks, but rather are just framed as leaks, because this, that, or the other political interest group wants the public to know something, but doesn't want them to know who released the information.
Video game companies have been doing that to us all the time. Oh my god, we've data mined this special secret. Ooh, whoa.
Yeah, same logic, basically. Those are strategic leaks, not actual leaks. Mm-hmm. So it could be that that's what this is. It could be that reformers in the government wanted to, quote unquote, leak this information so that they could put some pressure on the hardliners. In that sense, it could have more to do with the election coming up than anything. Hard to tell. It's not the most transparent government they have over there, so who knows? I guess, to be fair, even if it happened over here, we wouldn't necessarily know what the impetus was. But I think it happens often enough over here that we would probably be able to infer. It's not uncommon in Washington for the party in power or a president or whomever to leak information that they want, strategically speaking. So the nuclear talks were one thing. I don't know that there's been much else. I'm probably forgetting something. There's still quite a bit of drama around the world, but I don't know about big events. Like new things happening, per se. New age politics. I've still got stuff to get through. You know, I've got plenty more, but as far as like news items, not so much. So was there anything else that caught your eye?
I don't think so.
Okay. Let's see. I didn't really have I don't really have anything long form for today as far as like a principal topic. I tried to get some China stuff together, but I didn't finish it in time. It was just too much of it. We haven't talked about China much in a couple months, and it's so there's just a bunch of stuff that's built up. So I'm going to organize all that and try to have it for you next week, hopefully. There's been a lot happening as far as Hong Kong and financial reform and other stuff. So we'll have quite a bit to get through once we get to it. But for now, it's just not quite in a presentable form yet, basically. Let's see. So is there any particular region you wanted to start with?
Australia.
Australia.
Yeah.
Worried about the desks, huh, Nero?
Australia, New Zealand, yeah. Because
Well,
I heard recently, I think another headline article kind of thing I saw was a bunch of people pulling out of Afghanistan, and Australia is included in that set. And then the Taliban took something that was to no one's surprise since the military is moving out.
I haven't heard anything about the Australians pulling out of Afghanistan specifically, but that is something they're doing. You know, I guess they're not a part of NATO, but they are an American ally, so they had a deployment there. And but none of the allied deployments are going to stay after the U.S. leaves. You know, right now they're all planning on pulling out roughly along the same timetable as the United States. So it doesn't surprise me that you saw the headline, but I myself haven't read anything to that effect yet. Yeah, the last thing I read about the Australian military was when the when the Chinese embassy, I guess. I don't think it was like the embassy to Australia. Well, I don't remember exactly which embassy it was, but basically, a Chinese diplomat posted an incendiary photo. Well, it was basically I don't even know if it was like a photograph per se. It may have been staged, but basically it was like a soldier pointing his gun at a kid or something. And he posted it after there was some revelations in Australia that some Australian troops had been involved in potential war crimes in Afghanistan. So then the Chinese diplomat in question posted that, and there was a big hullabaloo about it. Basically just part of the Chinese government's overall pressure campaign targeting Australia over the past year or two. So it's not that surprising per se, but at least as far as the Australian military, that and the war crimes allegations are the only things I can kind of remember reading about off the top of my head.
Why are they pressuring Australia?
That has to do with COVID and the fact that the Australian government kind of sided with the United States in criticizing the lack of transparency on the part of the Chinese government vis-a-vis the evolution of the virus, basically. The Chinese government famously did not really work closely with international health institutions, and so the Trump administration criticized them pretty heavily for that. And the Australian government sided with the United States in criticizing that. They also voiced the same criticisms, basically. So the Chinese government responded to that pretty negatively, and that was basically where the current trade war between Australia and China comes from. You know, the Chinese government implemented a number of trade restrictions and inhibitions that have negatively affected Australian exports to China. So hence the pressure campaign. It's mostly been rhetoric. You know, trade has been part of it, but there's also a rhetorical component where Chinese state representatives will kind of criticize the Australian government, its policies, etc. That's part of the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy that Chinese diplomats have been exercising over the past year. That's kind of a messaging strategy, I guess, a PR strategy, if you like, just to kind of express discontent and highlight, well, maybe not highlight, but criticize foreign governments that are experiencing bad relations with China to try to pressure them into improving in one way or another. So the Australian war crimes thing was just one manifestation of that. I don't even know how seriously Chinese diplomats take it. You know, they probably just got a mandate from the government. Well, not even a mandate, just a requirement. They were probably ordered just to increase generic aggressive rhetoric, and they're just kind of phoning it in, probably.
General rhetoric increased to aggressive levels against Australia.
Yeah, pretty much. You know, I mean, Chinese foreign policy is not based on like values and whatnot. You know, so human rights is not like their core concern. I don't think it's ever been. So when they do complain about human rights, generally it's strategic. You know, they're doing it for some ulterior reason rather than just genuine concern for the well-being of Afghan children or whatever the issue may be.
Mm-hmm. Have we figured out anything else about the Uyghur situation? Because a lot of people have been saying it's straight up genocide what's happening, and China's like, no, it's fine.
It's not genocide.
But it seems like it's a tough situation for the Uyghur population in any case.
Yeah, it is. They're basically aggressively trying to assimilate them, just forcibly. You know, it's kind of more like what, I mean, for an American example, it's kind of like what the U.S. did with Native Americans for a long time, you know, where their kids were sent to boarding schools and they were taken off their land and forced into not sedentary lifestyle, basically forced to be farmers, where before they'd been hunters and gatherers. You know, there was just a lot of forceful changes to the culture. So there's something similar that the Chinese government is trying to do with the Uyghurs. You know, they're forcing them to learn Chinese, well, specifically Mandarin, and forcing them to learn certain skills, you know, allegedly. Some of that may just be a cover for slavery, basically, but yeah, nominally they're trying to teach them work skills of one sort or another.
So it would be kind of like the colonial attitude of, no, we're civilizing you.
Yeah, exactly. That's pretty much exactly what it is. So it's not genocide in the sense that they're trying to kill all of them, but they are trying to either directly or indirectly destroy the culture. If not destroy it outright, then they're trying to kind of change it to the point where it's not the same as it was before. You know, it would be unrecognizable, basically.
Yeah, that's what I've heard sometimes happens with, say, Christian churches, where you have state-approved Christian churches, and then you have the underground Christian churches that are more true to the messages of Christianity, but less beholden to the government, so they're not officially approved.
Exactly. Yeah, so they're not being put in death camps, and the plan isn't to like sort of breed them out of existence or anything like that. You know, they're just focused pretty narrowly on the culture. That just stems from the incidents of terrorism that occurred, you know, 10 some years ago. There was sort of a raft of terrorist attacks from involving Uyghurs. And I don't think the government really knew what to do about it at first, but eventually they decided to take a pretty hard line. And I think that's something that started with Xi Jinping, but I could be wrong. Yeah, but if it did start with Hu Jintao, it would have started like at the tail end of his term in power. Because I don't think they really started it up until after 2010. But certainly they've been taking the forceful approach since then. So yeah, not a great time to be a Uyghur, certainly. I think other than that, I think you asked about Australia and New Zealand specifically. I don't know. I mean, we talked about Australia and all the sexual abuse scandals. So that's kind of been the main thing in the news, I think.
The defiled discs.
Yeah. And then in New Zealand, they were doing something recently. I don't know if I can conjure the memory, though. It wasn't maybe it was COVID. I think New Zealand was maybe negotiating COVID vaccine passports. I could be wrong. I think everybody's been doing that, though, so that's not like a New Zealand specific thing.
Yeah, I saw Canada's doing that too. What does that mean? Do you need a new passport that's different, or do you need a vaccine page in your existing passport?
I'm not sure specifically how they're doing it. I think it doesn't actually involve your passport. I think it just means that you need to produce proof that you were vaccinated at some point. And how exactly they were doing that is sort of the subject of discussion. I think in some cases they were trying to figure out like paperwork that you could use, just like authentic, specifically government recognized paperwork that you could use in order to be recognized as having been vaccinated. But then they were also, I think, in some countries, they were talking about just doing it digitally, where you would be like maybe part of a database, or maybe where you would have like some kind of digital thing on your smartphone, basically, where you could just show it and then they would know you were vaccinated.
I did that for a COVID test. Negative COVID test shows up on your phone, and then you show it to people at the airport. You're good.
Gotcha. Yeah. So there's different ways you can do it, and that's sort of what's being navigated right now. Because one of the problems is that even if one government decides how they want to do it, that doesn't necessarily mean that other governments want to do it that way. And that's important because the whole point of the vaccine passport system is that travel would be eased. But if different governments can't agree on a common system, then that's not going to happen, even if each individual government has their own system. So it's not something that you can develop on your own. You also kind of have to negotiate it with other governments. I just can't remember what's going on in New Zealand. I think Arcinda is still in power. I think she's, third year in power? Something like that. Yeah, she's sort of the progressive politician who won election, like I want to say 2018, 2019, something around there. And she kind of got famous on the internet because she implemented widespread gun restrictions in New Zealand after the Christchurch shooting. I think that's what it was. That was when that far-right guy went out and just murdered a bunch of immigrants. So after that, there was new gun restrictions passed in New Zealand. And so, the internet kind of has a disproportionate American user base. So as a result, that kind of got wrapped up into the gun debate here in the United States. So there was a bunch of internet content featuring Prime Minister of New Zealand. But I don't know that she's been doing a whole lot since then. I'm sure she has, but I just haven't read about it. New Zealand just doesn't make the news a whole lot. That's probably a good thing. The countries that make the news the most are generally not making the news for the best of reasons. But yeah, New Zealand hasn't really had anything too dramatic happen over the past couple months. So that's the best I can do for Australia and New Zealand.
Not making too much noise. Good thing.
Yeah,
Australia
I think so.
pissing off China by criticizing them, so no, we criticize you.
Let's see. We did have actually, I should do the usual disclaimer while it's still early. The usual disclaimer is just that I'm not an expert in everything I talk about on here. It's probably pretty obvious, but just to point it out. And if I ever say anything wrong, stupid, or biased, please do point it out. I learn as much as this. I learn from this segment as well. I don't read the comments while we do this, but I will read them later. So, participation is encouraged in that regard. And if I'm wrong, I want to know more than anybody. I don't want to just spout misinformation. So I do appreciate all the feedback I get from people, be it in chat or on YouTube. Even if the feedback is negative. There was one really angry YouTube comment. That guy was obviously not amused by the segment. I'll try to keep my babbling to a minimal. Let's see, was there any other region that you really wanted to get to?
We did South America. We did the Middle East. What have we not done in a bit?
Let's see. Southeast Asia?
Sure.
I think we've done Southeast Asia too much lately. I don't have a whole lot on it. I mean, the big story in Southeast Asia is obviously the protests in Myanmar. That's been the main story. Are you familiar with Asean?
Asean, what is that?
It's like a multi-government institution in Southeast Asia. It's meant to kind of organize political cooperation between states on different issues of importance, but in practice, they don't really do much of anything. They kind of have a long-term goal of integrating the region economically and coordinating a common foreign policy, but that's probably never going to happen. Sort of the core pillar of ASEAN is non-interference in member state affairs. But because that is the main pillar, that basically means that they can't really do much in practice, because everybody is more concerned with protecting their own sovereignty than they are with actually cooperating. So cooperation in ASEAN tends to be pretty minimal. It's mostly coordinating things like travel and trade and stuff like that. But other than that, there's not much else. So ASEAN met recently to talk about Myanmar and the protests specifically. And my expectations were pretty low from the start, because again, non-interference is their main thing. So I pretty much just assumed that they would all agree not to do anything about it. And I was pretty much right. The agreement that was made was pretty non-committal. It had to do mostly with non-binding commitments by the different parties in Myanmar not to continue violence, which was especially weird because it's pretty much only the one party that's been committing the violence. Other than that, they're going to send third-party observers and mediators in order to try to gauge what's happening, in order to try to reach some kind of peace deal between the different parties involved. My suspicion is that the government is not going to actually honor any of that. Basically, they're not going to take it seriously. They'll be happy to let the mediators in, but that doesn't mean that they have to listen to them or do anything they say. So all told, it's mostly a symbolic agreement that was reached. I don't anticipate any of that actually leading to any significant change on the ground in Myanmar. So ASEAN doing what ASEAN does best, which is mostly nothing. As far as the protests in Myanmar, they're ongoing. I don't know that there's been a change in trajectory. I think there's been an escalation in violence. But other than that, not much. I think we already talked about... did we talk about the government in exile already?
I think we touched on it a little bit.
Okay. So we did get to that at least. I think the thing we didn't get to was the political economy of Myanmar, which I took some notes on here. And this just illustrates the economic base on which the current government is built. We've talked before about how the military in Myanmar is not really like a traditional military like we might think of it. The military basically is the government. And they have ties to business all throughout Myanmar. Some interesting trivia. Back in the 1950s, I think it was. Well, actually, it would have been the 1960s. Back in the 1960s, after the military seized power in Myanmar, one of the things that they did was to enable local garrisons deployed throughout Myanmar to engage in local business. So that meant either setting up businesses wherever they were deployed or partnering with local businesses. And the idea was that the local garrisons would be self-funding. They would be that would reduce the overall financial burden on the national budget. In practice, this meant that over the long term, Myanmar's military developed pretty deep ties with the business community in Myanmar. In fact, in many cases, it basically became the business community. So economic linkages between economic entities and the military are very extensive in Myanmar as a result of this. So just keep that in mind when we talk about this. So the biggest industry in Myanmar is gems. and specifically jade. Myanmar is the world's main source of jade. They're also a major source of rubies, sapphires, and sundry other gems. So this is a huge industry in Myanmar, and it's attached at the hip with the military. There's an institution called the MGE, which oversees most of the jade and gemstone trade in Myanmar. And it's responsible for, just as you might expect, licensing and regulating the sector, collecting royalties, and marketing jade and gemstones. And pretty much what you would expect. It's actually a state-owned enterprise. It's not like a regulator. And it's one of the state-owned enterprises that plays a quote-unquote dominant role, end quote, in Myanmar's economy. So this institution, again, it's not like a private sector entity, but it's also not a fully public sector entity. This entity generates about half of the government's revenue, and it spends half of the government's budget. It also is responsible for regulating most of the formal economy. Again, the gem trade is the principal industry. Let's see. So the value, to give you an idea of the money we're talking about, the value of Myanmar's jade trade is about $31 billion, or at least it was in 2014. It's based on officially recorded jade production figures of about 16,684 tons of jade. And the jade production in Myanmar has doubled roughly since then. So now it's going to be more in the realm of about 30,000 tons. As an interesting side note, most of the jade in Myanmar actually comes from Kachin state, which is one of the states that has a local ethnic militia that actually controls most of the territory and most of the economy. There's a number of ethnic militias throughout northern and northeastern Myanmar that have been fighting against the government for the better part of half a century. So the fact that most of the jade in Myanmar comes from this sort of pseudo-separatist political entity kind of illustrates how money trumps politics. If the Kachin state militias were really intent on depriving the government of that revenue that comes from jade, they could probably do some damage. But it probably makes much more sense to them to export that, because that gets them revenue. Let's see. Also, jade is a driver of the conflict. No surprise there. So that's a quick, rough snapshot of the political economy in Myanmar that illustrates how important the gem trade is. And it also illustrates just how infused Myanmar's military at an institutional level has become with the private sector. There's almost no difference. NGE, this sort of pseudo-state actor, kind of really illustrates that point really well, I think. So as we move forward with the protests, and as the potential rises for the conflict to ascend to a civil war, deteriorate into a civil war more accurately, as we kind of watch that happen, something to keep in mind is that all of that activity is basically being funded by the gem trade. You can also see that reflected in the sanctions that are being targeted on Myanmar. I think the United States has already tried to hit the Myanmar government with some sanctions, and a lot of them have targeted, gem-related industries and entities. So let's see. I think that's. I just thought that was some interesting trivia about Myanmar, I guess. Other than Myanmar, Thailand still has some protests. They're still trying to get the government to undo the military-imposed constitution. I don't think they've had much traction on that, or at least if they have, I haven't read about it lately. Let's see, in Malaysia, I don't think there's anything new in Malaysia. Nothing new in Brunei. Philippines is always... Basically, the Philippines is just the Duterte show. It's pretty much always the same. He's always up to something. But I don't think he's done anything too dramatic recently. I think there were some more allegations of protesters being put in dog kennels, but other than that, nothing new. That's kind of old hat. He actually did that last year, so... a little passé at this point. Vietnam, the big thing with Vietnam was the transition of power, but that actually happened last year. And I think we did talk about that a little bit. That was just sort of the old guard conservatives removing the newer reformers. You know, Vietnam had had kind of a more liberal, well, not liberal per se, but they had had more of a reformist government for much of the 10 years preceding, well, much of the past 10 years. And they'd been kind of opening up the economy, liberalizing it, etc. But they weren't really doing it out of a commitment to liberal policies. It was more corruption, basically. Corruption is not unusual in centralized authoritarian political systems, but in this case, the particular brand of corruption was one that used liberalization as an excuse to enrich powerful insiders. So the reformers were able to get away with that for a long time because they were generating a lot of economic growth. But things started to kind of come unglued a little bit when the major state-owned shipbuilder, I think it was, went under. It went bankrupt and they had to liquidate it. So that cost a huge amount of money, and it cost the government specifically a huge lot of money. And after that, there was a lot more political pressure on the part of conservatives in the government to try to undo some of the reforms or at least roll them back. And that culminated in the successful removal of the most powerful reformist politician in Vietnam. I don't remember his name, but he had been basically paramount leader in Vietnam for a while. So he's gone and has been replaced by a much more conservative cohort of communists in the Vietnamese government. And they're a lot less gung-ho about opening up the economy than the previous government. They'll probably still do it. You know, they do want the economy to continue improving. But they're probably going to be less exuberant about it. They'll probably slow the pace a bit. And that'll probably impact foreign policy a bit too, since the government, conservatives in the Communist Party in Vietnam are a little more favorable towards China and a little more skeptical of the United States. It's important to keep in mind that's relatively speaking. You know, in general, everybody in Vietnam's political system is a little concerned with China just because China is so big and because they have kind of a rough history together. And the United States is kind of the natural counterbalance there. So the Vietnamese government will probably continue to try to seek engagement with the United States. But the degree to which they do so will be lesser under the current government than it was under the preceding government. Nothing with Laos or Cambodia. Although I did see an interesting documentary about Cambodia that was about how Chinese investors are exploiting the free trade zones being set up in Cambodia. And they're building like a lot of entertainment industry type stuff, casinos, hotels, what have you, to the point where Cambodia is turning into an entertainment mecca for Chinese tourists. Yeah, apparently it's pushed out some of the Western tourists. Cambodia has become relatively more expensive because there's so much investment and demand from Chinese tourists. So as a result, Cambodia is less cost competitive relative to other tourist locations, and so Westerners have been going elsewhere. So that's basically just a story of Chinese influence rising along with the Chinese economy. You know, as the Chinese economy improves, you can expect the region to kind of reflect that. Yeah, it's a pretty interesting documentary. I'll try to post it on Twitter if I can. I don't think I finished like the last quarter or so of it, and I don't want to post anything that I haven't finished watching, so I'll try to get around to that this week. Don't think there's anything new in Indonesia. Indonesia passed a bunch of economic reforms last year, but we already kind of talked about that. I don't think there's been anything too exciting since then. Or at least there's nothing that's caught my eye since then, anyway.
I think Indonesia is one of the countries that is surprisingly large to
Yeah.
an American. You think of it as, oh yeah, it's a Southeast Asia country, but there are a lot of people in Indonesia.
Yeah, what is it, like 240 million?
Let's see. And predominantly Muslim, I believe.
Oh yeah. Indonesia is actually the most populous Muslim nation on earth.
Whoa. 270 million in 2019.
270. Oh wow. Okay.
So it's probably more than that.
Yeah, it's I think they've got even more than India, which is actually India is not a Muslim country, but they also, just by dint of being a huge country, they also have a huge number of Muslims. I don't think they have more than Indonesia, though. Yeah, India has 200 million, according to my quick Google research here. India has 200 some million Muslims, so Indonesia definitely beats them on that. But India is surprisingly high on that count. But yeah, Indonesia has the most, and most of its population is actually located on just one island. It's actually mostly on Java Island, which I think has 170 some million. I'll check that just to be sure. Oh, I was over. It was 145 million as of 2015. So what does that come out to? It was 145 and what did you say? 270?
270 million, yeah, for Indonesia.
Yeah, so a little over, what, about 53% of the total population is on Java Island. So it's a very densely populated island, suffice to say. You wouldn't think it had so many people looking at it on a map. You know, it's kind of nondescript. You know, you could easily just pass over it, but it's actually really huge in terms of demographics. And it's got some pretty interesting cultural history. I'm still kind of learning about it. I don't know a whole lot, but it's got a pretty rich cultural history, you know, politically, socially, economically, etc. It actually was originally influenced by India. You know, Indian culture actually pretty heavily influenced a lot of Southeast Asia. And there's still a lot of residual influence there, kind of just in terms of place names and words and languages and stuff. There's just kind of a weird amount of Sanskrit in some of the languages out there. Obviously, in Indonesia's case, Islam ended up sort of becoming more dominant, culturally speaking. But India had a lot of influence originally. I think you can see some of that in Bali. Bali, I think, is the last Hindu island in Indonesia, maybe the only one. So that's kind of a throwback to the pre-Islamic culture.
Yeah, some of the other countries in Southeast Asia ended up becoming more Christian. Like the Philippines, I believe, is more Christian.
Oh, it's all Christian. There's just like a large Muslim minority in Mindanao, like the southernmost large island. But I think even there, it's only like 20%. It's actually less than I thought it was. I used to think it was like a majority Muslim, but it turns out it's not. But yeah, the Philippines is heavily Catholic. Apparently, there's some Mexican influence in the Philippines. That kind of surprised me. I always knew that there was Spanish influence on Filipino culture, just dating from the colonial period when Spain colonized the Philippines. But I hadn't realized just how much of the Spanish influence came by way of Mexico. So there's actually some not insignificant Mexican influence on Filipino culture. Something else I need to read more about.
Was there a colonialist period for the caliphates and whatnot? Like, when was Islam brought to Indonesia, I guess is my question there.
Whew. I want to say it would have been 13 or 1400s. I want to say that's when it kind of first really... Well, it was probably introduced earlier than that, just through like traders. You know, Islamic traders were one of the principal vectors for the expansion of Islam outside of the Middle East. And they were also the main vector for expansion into Indonesia. So it's not like Indonesia was conquered per se. It was more like local leaders were converted to Islam. And then they started proselytizing amongst the population. But I don't think there was like a substantial Islamic presence in Indonesia until the 1300s. That's a guess on my part, so I could easily be wrong on that. But I want to say it would have been like sort of mid-late Middle Ages, kind of around there. So it's been around a while.
Mm-hmm.
I think I remember noting at one point that Islam did not get there all that much sooner than the Portuguese, and were the first European explorers to kind of really make it out there. So Islam beat Christianity in the region, but only by like 100 or 200 years, something like that. They didn't have a whole lot of time to really kind of establish itself before Christianity was introduced. Yeah, Islam kind of spread more along the traditional trade routes, so that's why sort of Java and the coastal areas of Borneo and Sumatra kind of all got converted. But then Christianity was introduced principally to the Philippines first. I think that was like the main initial conversion there. And then well, that was the Spanish. The Portuguese actually converted the, what were they called? They had a name. The name escapes me, but basically the islands that are sort of between Guinea and Borneo. Those islands were sort of conquered by the Portuguese, and they started converting the population there to Catholicism. So basically Islam from the west and Christianity from the east, roughly speaking. Yeah, there's still a lot of Christians in Indonesia, but there's just so many more Muslims that they're just totally dwarfed in terms of population.
Mm-hmm.
But there are certain islands in the eastern parts of Indonesia where Christians are either a minority or a near majority. Yeah, I think like Timor has a lot. And I get that. Ambosia? Basically the islands around the Spice Islands. Those are what I'm trying to remember. Those were pretty heavily proselytized, so they have significant populations of Christians. I think about half the population in the region, roughly, is Christian. And then there's a large Christian minority in the Celebes Island. I'm never going to remember how to pronounce that name. That name always throws me. It's this weird-looking island in Indonesia. It's one of the larger islands, but the name just always throws me. I want to say it's Celebes, but I could easily be wrong on that. But that, whatever that's called, that has a large Christian minority as well.
So Christianity would have been brought in from the Americas across the Pacific and then to these islands.
Well, in the case of the Philippines, west from west from Mexico. But in the case of the Portuguese, they would have sailed around the Cape and come from the west. But the islands that they ended up conquering were sort of in the east of the Indonesian archipelago. So that's why I say Christianity from the east. It was the easternmost islands that were converted for the most part. Mm-hmm. Sumatra and Java, the westerly islands, those were converted by Muslims pretty early on, and they kind of spread east from there. Yeah, unfortunately, they don't always get along either. The Christians and the Muslims in Indonesia kind of have a history of communal violence of one sort or another, and it's not even that distant. It's happened relatively recently. I think there were some clashes even just a few years ago, maybe even more recently than that I didn't hear about.
Well, the in-group is the best.
Yeah. To be fair to Indonesia, they've done pretty well as far as trying to tackle that. The Indonesian government really goes out of its way to try to prioritize communal harmony. And it's supposed to be a part of their national identity. So Indonesian nationalists try to kind of push that as much as they can. Doesn't always work. The vast majority are Muslim, so part of some Indonesian nationalists identify specifically with Islam as a kind of as part of the national identity. And we saw some of that with the election, I think in 2019 or so, when Widodo was running for re-election. He ended up having to kind of ally with an Islamic political party in order to try to win that. And there was the whole, issue of the Chinese Christian governor who got in trouble because he said something about the Quran that the opposition purposely mischaracterized so that they could use that as a way to offend and incite sort of the pious Muslim vote. So communal harmony doesn't always happen organically, but I have to give credit to the government for at least making the effort. And it's not nearly as violent as certain other places that have Christian minorities, so they don't do too badly in the grand scheme of things. But yeah, I think that's all of Southeast Asia, at least as far as news updates. Oh, I guess I forgot East Timor. I don't remember. I don't know anything about what's going on there. They haven't been in the news at all. At least not from what I've been reading. Are you familiar with East Timor, Neuro?
Not really, no.
Yeah, East Timor was one of Portugal's first colonies in the Far East. And it was the only one that they held on to. Well, that's not true. Well, it was one of the colonies that they held on to for the longest. By the end of the Portuguese Empire, they only had a few colonies. And the East Timor was one of them. And so that would have been, I think they didn't leave until 1975, I want to say. That feels recent to me, but I guess that's just because I'm older now. I guess I'm tipping my age a little bit there. But yeah, it wasn't until 1975 that the Portuguese Empire really kind of finally crumbled. And East Timor, as a result, is heavily Catholic. It's, the vast majority of the population is Christian Catholic and remains so to this day. It ended up getting absorbed into Indonesia when they got independence in the 70s. The Indonesian government had long claimed it as being theirs. I don't know what the claim was based on. I think they just kind of wanted it because it was in the region. Basically justifying it in terms of anti-colonialism, something to that effect. Somebody more familiar with Indonesian history could kind of elaborate on that. Maybe we've got someone in chat who can do that. But regardless, Indonesia did absorb it upon independence, and they didn't really treat the people very well, from what I remember. There was some opposition to the annexation on the part of local people in East Timor, and the Indonesian government responded pretty violently to the opposition. And there was also a lot of exploitation of the natural resources there, some of it corrupt. I don't know that that's that unusual. The military government that governed Indonesia through the mid-late 20th century was fairly corrupt and authoritarian. So for the military to be involved in the extractive resource industry is not that surprising. But regardless, the local military garrison, if not the national military in general, was involved in basically taking a cut of the profits from local resource extraction, as a result of which the localities in East Timor did not get their fair share. So that was also one of the complaints made by locals against the government. And over time, there was just more tension, and some people wanted independence again and started fighting for it. But the Indonesian government was able to pretty successfully kind of clamp down on that. So the violence never really stopped, but it was always kept at a pretty relatively low level. Eventually, what happened is that the UN got involved as a mediator, and they were actually successfully able to get the Indonesian government to agree to grant East Timor independence. As a result of which East Timor officially got its independence in the year 2000, I want to say. I think that was their first year of independence after breaking away from Indonesia. But yeah, that was definitely a feather in the cap of the United Nations. The Indonesian government probably could have pretty easily kept the territory. Indonesia is pretty powerful relative to, East Timor. It's just an island. But to their credit, they did agree to finally grant independence. So as a result, East Timor has officially been an independent state for, about 20 years now, thereabouts. So the violence has stopped for the most part, although they do still have problems with instability. And, I think democratic norms never really set in fully. So this, that, or the other major political faction will sometimes have like a militia. I think there's one guy in particular who has a militia that just kind of runs around the countryside, just exploiting resources and taking advantage of the people and whatnot. But I don't know what came of him. I haven't read about East Timor in a while, so they may have finally kind of gotten him to come around or killed him, one or the other. But other than that, it's just kind of a generic developing country. I don't think there's been a whole lot exciting happening there too recently. But yeah, that's a quick snapshot of East Timor.
Nice.
I guess technically it's called Timor-Leste. I think that was an adjustment that the government made in order to make the country name more indigenous. So when you see it listed in international lists of countries, for the Olympics or the UN or whatever, I think sometimes it's listed as Timor-Leste rather than East Timor.
What does lest mean? Does it mean east?
I don't know, actually, now that you mention it. I think you might be right. See. I think so. It's not really saying specifically. I'm not sure. I'd have to read a little more. I would guess you're right. It probably is just the local name for East. But I'd want to check up on that before committing. Let's see. Are we doing okay on time?
Mm-hmm.
What, we started at 8 o'clock? 8:15? Okay.
Ballpark, yeah. A little bit later than that. I got a good hour to go at least.
Gotcha. Did we have time to do some corrections?
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Try to slip these in here.
Lest is east in Portuguese. Thank you, chat.
Oh, cool. So it's actually Portuguese. Oh, wow. So I guess they didn't want to make the name more indigenous. Oh, that's right. I put it in the temp file.
Just a little bit less decipherable for English speakers.
Yeah. Yeah, that's kind of like Ivory Coast.
Mm-hmm. Côte d'Ivoire.
Yeah. Yeah, that's the official name. Like, even in English, you're supposed to call it Côte d'Ivoire.
Mm-hmm.
Don't know why they wanted to do that, but they certainly went out of their way to. I guess it was important to them. So let's see, some corrections. Oh yeah, the ghost gun thing. I still didn't get it right. So I thought originally the ghost guns just referred to 3D printed guns. And so then I kind of read a little more about it. And so the correction last time was that ghost guns are guns that have parts that have some parts that are 3D printed and some parts that are bought.
By ghosts.
Yeah, by ghosts. But apparently even that's not right. There was somebody who pointed out that actually it's just guns that have parts that are not traceable.
By ghosts.
But by ghosts, yes. So 3D printing doesn't really have any part of it per se. It's the parts could be 3D printed, but you can also buy parts that are not traceable just on the open market. And from what I was reading, that had to do with like kits. I'm not super into the gun culture, so I'm not as familiar with this stuff as some of the people in chat probably are. So feel free to correct me on this. But there are apparently kits of disassembled guns that you can buy, and then you can assemble them yourself. The kits don't apparently, I think I read that the kits don't have all of the parts you need, so you still have to buy some of them yourself. But the thing about the kits is that the parts that come in them don't have like serial numbers. They're not registered, or, basically you just can't trace them. So that's more where the ghost gun issue comes from.
So ghost means less traceable gun. It doesn't necessarily mean 3D printed gun, but it could be 3D printed parts.
Could be, but yeah. Yeah, I've read more about 3D printing and the issue that poses as far as guns. So I think that's why I kind of homed in on that. But if I'd read more of the details of what the Biden administration was proposing, I probably would have learned more about it, such that I would know that it was not exclusively 3D printing. You can apparently get guns with untraceable parts just without any 3D printing, and I didn't know that. So thank you to the person who corrected me. I guess I didn't write down the name, but the correction is appreciated. Let's see. Oh, this will be fun. So originally, as far as where COVID-19 originated, the Chinese government was originally saying that it first emerged out of a wet market in Wuhan. And so, of course, the Trump administration came out and said that that story had holes in it, and they said that the Chinese government was lying and that they were, covering up their culpability in the outbreak of the crisis. And of course, famously, the Trump administration said that there was a virology institution in Wuhan that the virus had originated in and had escaped from. So obviously there was a lot of politics involved in that. The U.S. government had a reason, had an incentive to try to distract attention from some of the flaws in its own COVID response. And then the Chinese government, of course, was famously cagey about how the virus emerged and was reluctant to interact with international health institutions. So in general, in the United States, I think a lot of people were pretty critical about the U.S. government and its claims about the virology institution in Wuhan and whatnot, just because a lot of people were pretty skeptical about the Trump administration in general. Sort of an example of the boy who cried wolf, as it were, sort of a political equivalent of that. So in general, I think the consensus in the United States had been that the wet market story was sort of the best story we had. Maybe not the only explanation, but the only one that we kind of had to go on. So one of the developments on that story is that the Chinese government has officially distanced itself from that. So that is no longer the Chinese government's official explanation for how the COVID virus emerged and where it emerged.
What is the current one then?
They don't really have one.
But
They've got some. Go ahead.
But they know that it wasn't that.
Yeah,
or at least they're not going to talk about it if it was.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah, they've got some other conspiracy theories that they've kind of pumped out. There was one conspiracy theory about some war games that were held, and they were saying that maybe the virus was introduced to China by way of American military personnel who were participating in those war games. Well, I shouldn't say war games. That's not quite the right. It was like a training competition type deal. I'm not sure what the technical name of that is, but basically teams from around the world, and they compete in these sort of military games. So they were saying that could have been one vector by which the virus was introduced, and I think they had some others. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. But those were always kind of fringe sort of theories. The official theory had been the wet market story, but now, since they've kind of pushed back on that, distanced themselves from that, now all they have is the fringe stuff. So I don't think they have anything official now as far as how it emerged. So kind of back to square one on that count, just for future reference. So when you hear people talking about viruses escaping from secret Chinese labs, that is not entirely conspiracy theory. I suspect it's going to be the most popular amongst people who are involved with conspiracy theories, but amongst those who are not, that story does not entirely have... it's somewhat credible now in a way that it wasn't before, just on account of the Chinese government distancing itself from the story of the wet market. So just something to keep in mind going forward. I don't think we'll ever hear the full story on how the virus emerged, because I don't think Beijing really sees it as in its interest to really kind of cooperate on that count. So there's not going to be any progress on that, probably.
Yeah, well, if the reason for it doesn't sound good, then they wouldn't release it, regardless of what it was.
Even if it's not, even if it doesn't sound bad, they would probably still be cagey.
They feel like they're not obligated to, and they have an opaque system anyway. So why would we tell them?
Actually, yeah, that sums it up perfectly. That's exactly why. It's just kind of Chinese political culture at this point, pretty much.
Yeah, I could see how, just from a foundational standpoint, you would see a lot of privacy of information as part of national security. It's easy to lump those two together. So if you find out, then maybe you use that as an edge for your government to avoid that situation in the future, but you don't trust other governments to not use that information against you.
Yeah. Nails it right on the head. I don't think that there's going to be like a big lawsuit. Mm-hmm. I've read some people on the internet talking about trying to get reparations of some kind from the Chinese government, and that's definitely not going to happen. Yeah, there's no kind of international institution that could arbitrate that. Mm-hmm. And even if there were, I don't think Beijing would ever be interested in that.
Not even the Justice League?
Not even the Justice League, Nero. These communists, Nero, I tell you, they have no respect for anything. Not even the Justice League.
Not even Batman. Man.
Let's see. This next one isn't so much a correction as it is an elaboration. So we were talking about some of the reasons for the shortages of computer chips around the world. And, we talked about different factors, but one that I kind of overlooked was Bitcoin. In order to farm Bitcoin, you need processors. So because the price of Bitcoin has been going up, there's been a lot more people trying to mine Bitcoin, and so that's created a big surge in demand for graphics cards. So that is also another contributing factor. Also a drought in Taiwan, weirdly. Apparently, fab units that produce chips need a lot of water, and the drought in Taiwan is making it difficult for them to meet production quotas. It's another example of how environmental factors can impact the economy. Let's see, we already talked about the vaccine stuff. Oh yeah, we had somebody in YouTube kind of correcting me on some of the stuff we were talking about as far as the Greeks being expelled from Turkey. So this was oh, by the way, I was right about the Armenian genocide being during World War I. Unless Wikipedia is wrong, it started in 1915 and ran until the early 1920s. So it kind of played out over a long period of time there. But anyway, that aside, the expulsion of Greeks was not something that was done in retaliation to anything. So it's not as though the Turks expelled the Greeks and then the Greeks expelled the Turks in Greece in retaliation. Apparently, the expulsions were mutually agreed as part of, I think, a treaty. I don't remember which one. Maybe I'm wrong on that too, but regardless, it wasn't like a violent expulsion. It was done nominally anyway, voluntarily by the respective governments. I think maybe I was thinking more about the burning of Smyrna. Smyrna is like a West Coast city in Turkey that used to have a very large Greek population. I think like half of it was Greek. Well, maybe not even that. Maybe it was like, well, whatever it was. It had a large Greek population, and it was considered like the cultural center, the center of Greek culture in the region. I think maybe even more so than in Greece at the time. I could be wrong on that, though. But basically, there was just a number of large Greek businesses there, lots of Greek merchants, that kind of thing. So what happened is during the, I think it was called the Greco-Turkish War, there was a big war between Greece and Turkey at that time that had to do with, basically fallout from World War I. So Greece was supposed to get a good chunk of Western Turkey, as a zone of influence, so to speak. And the Greek government sent troops there to try to establish their control. So there was a war between Turkish nationalists and the Greek government, and the Greeks ended up losing. And there was a lot of violence against Greeks over the course of the war and after. So Greeks did suffer during this period, but the expulsions that came after were not like violent expulsions per se. They were actually agreed upon by the Greek and Turkish governments. So I just wanted to make that clarification. And then somebody was talking about Romania. I think this was also a YouTube comment. Lots of really cool YouTube comments.
Yeah, they said people were leaving Romania due to corruption.
Yeah, that's what they were mentioning. So we were talking about examples of depopulation corresponding with economic growth, basically a high standard of living. Mm-hmm. And I mostly focused on Japan, but then to just give a countervailing example, I tried to come up with an example of a country experiencing depopulation, but that was not experiencing economic growth. So I thought of Romania, but as this person pointed out, Romania has actually been experiencing pretty decent economic growth over the past couple decades. The depopulation they've been experiencing has stemmed more from corruption in Romania, alienating people. So alienating people and also interacting with the economy in a negative way, such that there's not sufficient economic opportunities. So it's not just brain drain in Romania. It's not just like educated people leaving and skilled workers leaving. There's also lots of blue collar labor that leaves Romania to work as, trades like plumber or what have you in other countries. So Romania in that sense is not the best example of a country suffering from depopulation per se. There's other factors that are kind of causing that. Let's see. So that's all I had for corrections. We were able to get through all of that until I get more, which I definitely will at some point. Let's see. And I think we did have some questions. Yeah. I got a couple here. Let's see. Can you ask Agent Smith thoughts on the Chinese influx of man-made islands, naval bases popping up in the South China Sea? Yeah, that's... Well, for those not familiar with the issue, there's long been a dispute over which country controls the South China Sea, and specifically some of the islands and islets in the region. So different governments have had claims on the area going back, centuries, some cases, but nobody's ever really had the power to kind of exert sovereignty over them, or an incentive to exert sovereignty. 100 years ago, they weren't really worth anything, so why bother? But more recently, obviously, China has developed economically to a significant degree in recent decades, and so now the Chinese government has a lot more resources with which to pursue territorial claims like this. Another factor, though, is that there's a lot of natural resources under the ocean that are actually exploitable now. There are underwater, I shouldn't say underwater, but undersea, let's say, undersea natural gas deposits, undersea oil deposits. And there's also technology now that could allow for the mining of rare earths materials that kind of pile up at the bottom of the ocean. So basically, ocean actually is relevant real estate now. It's actually worthwhile territory to a degree that it kind of wasn't before. So those two factors, the Chinese government having more resources and the value of ocean real estate increasing, those two factors have kind of pushed the Chinese government to start to push harder for its claims in the region. Also, there's a security element. A lot of critical trade for China comes through the Straits of Malaccas, through the South China Sea. And so the Chinese government has a desire, well, more specifically, the Chinese military has a desire to try to extend the military's reach into the region in order to try to protect that supply chain better. Some of it is just nationalism. They just kind of want to expand China's defense periphery, as it were. I think they had like different tiers that they wanted to work on. The first tier was the tier that was closest to China, which was like Taiwan and the South China Sea. But over the long term, they want to expand to have a greater military presence, like around the Philippines and Indonesia. And then there was like a third tier, even further than that. So that's more like long-term strategic planning there. But the short-term strategic planning manifests as the push into the South China Sea. And again, that's just about defending supply chains and also just projecting force in the region generally. See, so what this person is referring to when they talk about the man-made islands is that the islands in the region are generally not very big. Some of them are just like barely qualify as atolls in some cases. So what the Chinese government did in order to solidify its claim to some of the islands and whatnot is they started dredging and dumping sand on these atolls and whatnot to try to turn them into bigger islands. And they did that so that they could build airstrips, generally. I think they've also built like a naval base on one of them. I'm not as confident about that, but they've certainly been building airstrips. And there was one of the larger islands they actually built a small town on. And they even gave it like its own little, what would you call it? What's a subdivision in a Chinese province? Prefect? I want to say it's prefect. So basically, they made this one larger island that they built the town on a prefect, or precinct, maybe, as part of one of the territories in South China. I don't remember which. I think it was maybe Hainan or something. So that's been a process that's been ongoing for, I think, 10 years now, thereabouts. And I think they started doing it about like around 2010 or so. Let's see. So that's a rough summary of what's been going on in that regard. The security element also includes things like control of airspace. They've tried extending their, I forget what the full name is. Basically, it's an identification zone. A country, a state, can impose an identification zone in airspace that they basically control, or maybe even don't control in some cases. But the idea is that aircraft moving through that airspace has to identify itself, or otherwise it'll come under attack, or it'll be escorted out of the region. So the Chinese government tried to use its control of the islands as an excuse to expand its identification zone for air traffic in the region. Let's see. Other countries that have claims on that same sort of space in the South China Sea, they just haven't had nearly as many resources to work with to kind of counteract the Chinese. So the Chinese have largely gotten most of the islands that they want, and are pretty much present throughout the South China Sea at this point. There's a couple examples of some states kind of holding out. I think there was like a lagoon where this Filipino ship was marooned. It basically got stuck. It got beached on the in and around the area in the lagoon. I don't remember if it was in the lagoon or outside it, but it's beached there. And the Philippine government has been basically keeping the crew supplied just so that they can use that as an excuse to maintain a military presence in the region. Just to kind of have a military presence around disputed territory. It's also nice because it means that the ship can't be like driven off. It's not like the Chinese Navy can intimidate them into leaving. The ship is beached, and so they would have to very physically deal with the ship in order to remove it and its crew. And that's not something the Chinese government has been willing to do yet. I think other governments haven't been as committing to kind of fighting for their claims to the region. Malaysia and Indonesia in particular have kind of not made it a priority, so they haven't been in the news as much. I think the Philippines has been the main one that's been kind of having trouble with China in this regard, and then I think also Vietnam. Vietnam has some islands in the Spratlys. Is that what it was? The Spratly Islands and the Paracel Islands are like the two main island groups under dispute, and I think the Spratlys are the more northerly islands. Well, whichever the more northerly one is, that's the one that the Vietnamese are claiming. But their claim is, it faces a lot of problems because the Chinese basically forcibly annexed those islands in the 1970s. And so the Vietnamese government does not have any islands under its control that it is claiming right now. With the Philippines, they've got a few under their control still. They have a few where they have like an outright presence on. But the Vietnamese don't really have that luxury. And as a result, their claims are much weaker correspondingly. But let's see. So that's a quick summary of the South China Sea dispute. As far as my thoughts on it, I think it's just inevitable. I mean, it was inevitable that the Chinese government would start fighting more for these old territorial claims, as it got more capacity to do so. So it doesn't surprise me in the least. I think the problem is more for other countries. The claimants in the region obviously don't want to just give up the islands for nothing, but there's also not much they can do about it. The United States could help, but the trouble there is twofold. One, China's influence over the countries in the region is mostly economic rather than military. So it's not like we can just sail the Navy through the disputed territory, which the U.S. does regularly. They call them, what do they call them? Freedom of movement something? They have some catchy military acronym for them. Basically, the U.S. Navy will just deliberately sail through the disputed territory, specifically just to point out that the United States does not recognize Chinese claims in the region.
That's
but that
funny.
only goes to... Sorry, what?
That's pretty funny.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, but the thing is, that's kind of the only thing that we can really do, that the United States can do. But it doesn't really counteract the economic influence, which is the main influence. The reason that Indonesia and Malaysia haven't been complaining more is because they're worried about jeopardizing trade with China, which is kind of more important to them than the South China Sea dispute. In the case of Vietnam, they have pre-existing security concerns, so they're more willing to fight for it. And in the Philippines case, nationalism is a part of the politics, and it's a kind of a sensitive part of the politics. So they're more willing to fight for it on that count. But the United States can't really counteract that economic influence easily. So as a result, there's not a whole lot the United States can do. Really, the United States can only help states that really want to ask for help. And that's been more the problem. I mean, hypothetically, the United States could pay for these countries to significantly build up their navies, or at least to significantly build up their military presences on disputed islands. But thus far, they haven't been willing to do that. So the U.S. is kind of hamstrung in that sense. And we're kind of restricted to doing the freedom of movement operations, which are just kind of a band-aid. They do help with the fishing boats. That's kind of a weird one. One of the things that the Chinese government does, just on account of being like an all-encompassing authoritarian one-party state, is that they go out of their way to try to make connections between the state and every kind of actor, economic actor, political actor, what have you. And one of the manifestations of that is that fishing fleets are kind of attached. They have linkages to the Chinese Navy. And the Chinese government calls them naval militias, something weird like that. And the idea is that these fishing fleets can be mobilized by the Chinese Navy in order to help lay claim and enforce claims in the region.
Like privateers.
Not quite so aggressive. They're not raiding anybody. Mostly they fight for the claim just by being present. If there's some claim that is kind of being challenged during a particular news cycle, for example, they may call in the fishing fleet just to kind of have those ships there.
Go fish in that area. Let them know that it's ours.
Yeah, it's basically passive-aggressive fishing. That's kind of what it amounts to. It sounds silly, but I mean, that's just kind of how territorial disputes play out like that. If you can change the facts on the ground, then you have an advantage in the dispute. And if your fishing fleets are regularly fishing an area as though you control them, that just kind of solidifies your claim. So
Look, your fishing is pretty good, but you have a bit of a serene expression on your face. Could you just show me your best glare? Okay, yes, please fish like that. Thank you.
So the Chinese Navy, in particular, over the past couple months, has been mobilizing its naval militia, quote unquote, to try to confront, I think the Philippines in particular has been who they've been going after. Yeah, there's been more action on the South China Sea recently. The naval militia thing has been in the news. And I think they've been, there was something else. I think they were just bitching out one or the other country for trying to enforce their claim to it. I mean, it's mostly political theater for the most part. I mean, China pretty much controls the area at this point. I mean, if you wanted to, hypothetically, you could reach an agreement where China agreed to evacuate certain areas such that the region were more equitably distributed amongst regional nations. But other than that, I mean, the only way that the Philippines or Malaysia or whoever is going to really lay claim to that area and have that claim mean anything is if they expel the Chinese from the islands. And they would only be able to do that violently. And that would mean a violent confrontation with China, which I don't think anybody in the region wants. You know, maybe with U.S. backing they could pull it off, but I don't think even anybody wants to do it, even with U.S. backing, because of what it would mean for trade relations with China. So it's probably not going to happen. So, you know, for me, this issue just is kind of more about, you know, whenever it's brought up in the context of worrying about greater Chinese influence and power. So it's more of like a political wedge issue at this point than it is a substantive security issue. You know, at this point, China pretty much has the region in hand, and the facts on the ground are very much in their favor.
You say that now, but when the passive-aggressive snorkelers come in...
Yeah, then we'll be in trouble. But until then, it's not that an exciting issue. You know, it's more of a legal issue at this point. You know, legally, can China get other countries to recognize its claims? And right now, the answer is no. So there's a lot of legal warfare kind of going on. You know, I think the Philippines even took them to an international court at one point, and the court did rule in the Philippines' favor, but the Chinese response was to just ignore it. So it just gives you an illustration of how little traction there probably is in actually changing the facts on the ground. You know. So that's pretty much it. It's kind of a stagnant issue in that sense. I think the only changes we'll see in that issue will come if China just really forcefully tries to enforce the claim by explicitly expelling foreign fishing boats and trying to expel what garrisons there are from other countries in the region. You know, that hypothetically could happen, but I think they know if they did that the U.S. would probably jump in and provide assistance in one fashion or another. I don't know how much assistance it would be. That would probably be variable and depend on the circumstances, but I don't doubt that the U.S. would take the opportunity to jump in. So probably they won't do that, but hypothetically they could. Let's see. So I think that if I don't answer a question to someone's satisfaction, feel free to ask again, and I'm happy to return to it. Let's see. Next question was, how is the situation in Myanmar doing? I was having a conversation about it with a coworker who was from there and told me about the military coup. Would you care to elaborate on the Myanmar situation? We talked about it a bit before, but I can kind of give the Cliff Notes version here. Basically, the military has been in control of Burma since the 1960s, when they staged a coup. Like I was saying earlier when we were talking about the political economy, you know, the government in Myanmar basically is the military. The military as an institution is the preeminent governing institution in Myanmar. About 10 years ago, there was a typhoon that hit, and the government's response was pretty piss poor, which delegitimized them even more than usual, even more than they already had been. And also the government was getting worried about its dependence on trade with China. They wanted to diversify their trading partners a bit. So because of these two things, you know, because of these two factors, the Myanmar government decided to liberalize. They decided to try to open up the country's political system a little bit, and they did that in recognition that they would not be able to liberalize their trade without doing that, since Western nations would not want to trade more with a country that had human rights abuses and whatnot. So the country's economy and politics opened up significantly. That's not to say it was free. Ultimately, the changes were pretty superficial. The democratic institutions that the Myanmar government created were largely undermined by the fact that a huge chunk of the seats in parliament, I think it was like 25% in the legislature, were appointed by the military itself, which gave them a de facto veto over most any legislation that might be passed in the legislature. Now, as it was, there were elections in 2015, I want to say, and they were handily won by the main opposition political party, as led by Aung Suu Kyi, who was a famous advocate for human rights and democracy in Burma at that time. Things have changed since then a bit, but that's kind of outside the scope of this answer. But basically, the Democrats were able to handily win elections, and they dominated the legislature. And if not for that 25% seat hold on the legislature, they probably would have more fully democratized the country. But that was never going to happen. The military never really had much interest in that. Basically, the military liberalized the country's politics just enough to get access to global markets, and nothing more than that. And they never had much intention of fully giving up their control over important aspects of state government. Specifically, the military never gave responsibility for national security affairs to the civilian government. Even when the civilian government was fully in control, in power, they never actually had control over the military or foreign policy. That stuff was reserved for the military as an institution. So it was really only ever a pseudo-democracy. But that was a more or less tolerable state of affairs. Liberals had some room to advocate for more liberalism and reform, and the military was able to get greater access to global markets as they wanted. And also they were able to ease some of the tension that had been building over the previous half century. So what happened recently is that in the most recent election, the Democrats did really well again, and no surprise. But then the military just kind of decided enough is enough. We're just going to scrap all of these democratic institutions. They quote-unquote staged a coup, but saying they staged a coup implies that there was a civilian government to coup in the first place. The reality is that they were already in power, and they had just allowed some ambit for civilian institutions to come to the fore. And now they've basically just canceled that. That nascent civilian institutional flowering that they allowed has been scuppered now. But it's not the case that they fully seized power. They pretty much already had most of it. And as to why they felt it necessary to seize back the power they had given to the civilian government, that's actually not really clear. It's a little ambiguous just what the military kind of hoped to gain by doing this. And the best guess at this point, the best analysis that I've read is that the leader of the military, I don't remember his name off the top of my head, but basically the leader of the military is kind of getting older. He's getting closer to retirement. But, as with all authoritarian political systems, there's never really a good succession policy in place. And so retirement is kind of a dangerous thing, because you may step down from power and the next guy who comes in could just steal all of your money or have you killed or whatever. So the suspicion is that this guy who's nearing retirement, who's the guy who's the head of the Myanmar military, he may have started worrying about how to secure his retirement, and he may have seen civilian institutions as a threat to that. And so hence he's gotten rid of them so that he can maybe create some new civilian institutions in which he has greater power and hence greater security, or maybe just a complete redesign that doesn't involve civilian institutions.
If these civilians don't stop it, they're going to ruin my retirement.
Yeah, that's pretty much his attitude, it seems. But I would point out that this is just a guess. We still don't know entirely just what the logic was behind the coup recently. And like we were talking about, I think last week, some politicians who had been part of the opposition political party have started to form a government in exile. And some dissidents who have been protesting against the government have started fleeing to the hills, as it were, so that they can receive training and support from some of the ethnic separatist militias in the north of the country that have been fighting against the government for, again, the better part of half a century now. So that's pretty much where we are. That's a quick and dirty summary there. Kind of leaves out the Rohingya issue, but if you're just talking about politics, that's kind of a peripheral thing. Let's see. So hopefully that's a satisfactory summary there. As far as how it's doing now, I don't know as much about that. I haven't been following it day to day. As far as I know, the military has basically been the government has basically been incrementally ramping up violence against the protesters. And the protesters, in turn, have been becoming more militant, although there still hasn't been a lot of protester violence thus far. That could change depending on how the situation changes with the ethnic militias. I think I was reading that the ethnic militias have ramped up operations against the Myanmar military. There was some border skirmishing with militias based in neighboring countries, targeting a border post, I think. And I think there was another example of an ethnic militia that had successfully taken some forward operating base or something that the military had set up. So things seem to be heating up in terms of conflict between the military and the ethnic militias. But as far as the protesters and the opposition goes, I haven't seen too much radicalization there. I haven't seen too much militancy there yet. There's been some signals that they will, but nothing tangible yet. So let's see. And let's see. The next question was, what should the U.S. government's role be in cryptocurrencies regulation? This is similar in nature to economic policy around reining in multinational corporations, i.e., if corporations or cryptocurrencies can be headquartered anywhere, how does the U.S. regulate but still attract innovative tech and leading companies? This is a very timely question because one of the big trends that's emerging right now is a trend towards regulating tech. And also there's been a big push now to regulate overseas corporate taxation, basically. There's more and more agreement that corporations are kind of getting undertaxed because of their behavior and exploiting overseas legal loopholes. So there's kind of a movement now at the national level in different countries to coordinate more on that. So given that Bitcoin and cryptocurrency could be one way for corporations to exploit tax loopholes, I suspect Bitcoin will probably come under more regulatory attention in the next year or so. But that say, the question of what should the US government do, that's kind of a normative question. That kind of comes down to political preferences, and I kind of try to stay away from those to a degree on here. What things they could do, I think, is a little more difficult for me to ascertain since I don't have a background in cryptocurrency. The whole point of cryptocurrency is that it's designed to get around institutional restrictions, be they financial sector, financial firms, kind of cutting financial firms out of the financial process and evading government oversight. That's kind of what the laundering is about. Lots of criminal entities have used Bitcoin for money laundering, and obviously I think everybody is kind of familiar now that you can buy illicit goods and services on the deep web, or probably not even on that, but in general you can use cryptocurrency to kind of evade scrutiny in order to feed your drug habit, whatever drug you may want. So just the fact that cryptocurrency is designed to cut out government and corporate entities, that by its nature means that it's hard to regulate. That hasn't stopped China. China has basically banned it. But I don't know how successful they've been at that.
Banned all crypto across the board?
Pretty much, yeah. I mean, all the major not the Bitcoin. I always call it Bitcoin because that's the one I always think of. But yeah, they pretty much have a blanket ban on cryptocurrencies. I think I remember reading about that. The Chinese government doesn't like the idea of sort of this, well, the Communist Party of China really doesn't like anything it can't control or at least watch. So it kind of went out of its way to try to curtail usage of cryptocurrency. I don't know how successful that effort's been. I would assume not very. But technically, you are not supposed to use them in China, if I'm remembering this correctly. But as far as what the United States or Europe could do, or other countries, I don't know. I think the most they could do is to try to ban financial firms from using it. They could say that banks or what have you could not handle it, and that would make it more difficult for financial firms to invest in it. So that would not eliminate usage of cryptocurrency, but it would make it much more difficult. It would certainly impact the value, at least. But yeah, I don't think there's any good solutions to that. I don't think there's any good regulations in the cards that can really just totally curb the potential negative impact of cryptocurrency. And as far as doing it while still attracting innovation and whatnot, again, unless they just outright ban it, it probably won't matter what they do. Cryptocurrency will probably continue to be innovated regardless of what the U.S. government does or what other governments do, just by dint of its decentralized nature. That is principally the attraction of cryptocurrency, I think. There's more usage just in the general economy. There are more people investing in it, but I think the principal interests still lay with people who are trying to get away from major institutions. Not necessarily illicitly, they're not all criminals. Some people just don't like the idea of the government keeping track of their money, or they're concerned about the soundness and safety of their money and think that their money will be safer. It's safer if it's stored in the form of cryptocurrency where governments can't get to it. Basically libertarians. That's the short version of that. Libertarians like cryptocurrency.
Less government interference.
Yeah. Well, virtually none. There's really not a hell of a lot governments can do about it. In terms of the integration of cryptocurrency into the financial market, yeah, there's a lot governments can do about it. But in terms of just stopping people outright from using it or blocking it, I would imagine that's almost impossible. The network is so decentralized, and the cryptocurrency itself relies on blockchain, which can't really be corrupted. So governments are kind of stuck on that. There's not much they can really do about it other than kind of pick at it at the edges. I might add here, as I've pointed out many times in the past, I don't have a background in cryptocurrency.
Me neither. We have something in common.
Yeah, this isn't really our wheelhouse here. We used to get a lot of questions about cryptocurrency back in what would have been 2017, 2018.
Yeah, it was like a weekly thing where we would get what are your thoughts on crypto? And it would be usually that vague. Yeah, so I still don't have a whole lot of reading in my sort of wheelhouse here that I can refer to on this. I can just kind of refer to it sort of from the perspective of somebody with a background in economics and just having tracked technological development over time. So that's kind of all I can bring there. So if you're looking to me for really insightful analysis of cryptocurrency, I can't really provide that. So just be wary of that. I don't want anybody to dump a bunch of money in cryptocurrency because I said this, that, or the other. But Agent Smith, you go on that World Discussion Show and you say lots of very smart words, and I want to know how I can invest my money and get rich really fast, just from a simple recommendation.
If I knew how to make money really fast, then I would be a much wealthier person. Unfortunately, I do not. But it were otherwise. Let's see. How are we doing? How much time do we have?
20 to 30 minutes.
20 to 30 minutes. Okay. More than I was expecting. Okay. So we got through questions, and I don't think we have any old questions either. I think we kind of picked through them. And there's certainly no recent ones we haven't gotten to.
Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for handling questions tonight.
Okay, thank you very much, sir. Let's see. Some stuff on inflation. Oh, did you hear about the spy drama in Eastern Europe?
No. What's spy drama?
There was a cache of black market weapons that exploded in the Czech Republic. And the suspicion is that the weapons were being transported to Syria, specifically to Syrian rebels. And the explosion is not thought to have been an accident. Apparently, the suspicion is that Russian intelligence was involved. The thinking is that they were trying to prevent the weapons from getting to opponents of the Syrian regime, which they're allied to, technically. To be fair to the Russian saboteurs in this case, apparently there's also a suspicion that they didn't mean for the explosion to go off in the Czech Republic. Apparently they may have meant for it to go off in transit. Obviously, it's kind of a diplomatic snafu to go blowing things up into other countries. So the suspicion is that they wanted to avoid that, but apparently failed. Yeah, apparently it's not the first time something like this has happened. I was also reading that there was a different cache of weapons that was blown up in, what was it, Bulgaria. And similar logic. There was also a very suspicious case of a Bulgarian arms dealer involved in the dealing of black market weapons whom was almost assassinated. He was almost killed in an assassination attempt involving a nerve agent, which should sound pretty familiar by this point. For anybody following Russian espionage in the past 10 years. So apparently Russian intelligence is pretty active over there, trying to track all these weapons that are being smuggled into Syria. Kind of part of a pattern of greater Russian adventurism, you might say. I can't say I blame them trying to sabotage weapons like this. I think it could be done more gracefully, but beggars can't be choosers. I think it's more interesting that they're deploying mercenaries abroad that I find particularly interesting, because that's kind of a new form of influence. It used to be if you wanted to influence other countries, then you might send your own military and build bases there, or you might train up the military of the country you want to partner with, or you might help them buy modern military equipment, preferably from you. But I haven't really heard about influence being exerted by way of non-state actors, specifically mercenaries like this, and through politically connected consortiums like the Wagner Group. That's kind of like a weird new innovation. It's pretty neat if you're into espionage and political violence anyway. Yeah, I've been trying to track sort of the proliferation of Russian mercenaries in different countries, and they're kind of racking up a decent list. Basically, my inference thus far is that they're attracted to regions with weak governance and weak political cultures. Basically, countries with political systems where there's like a strongman ruler and very little political oversight. You know, the idea is that sort of these political elites whose power is threatened by rebel groups or whatever may want to trade access to resources in their country in exchange for access to high-quality Russian mercenaries. That seems to be the quid pro quo. Because wherever you see Russian mercenaries, there's almost invariably some economic deal going on. There's some kind of connection between a Wagner Group company, or more accurately, a company connected to the Wagner Group, and access to some resource in the country. It's pretty interesting. You could consider it a unique form of influence engineered specifically by, what would you call it, an illiberal democracy. You know, with liberal democracies, they tend to be happy to take advantage of political corruption like this in developing countries, but they don't really cultivate it per se, and they don't integrate it into their own corrupt patronage networks. In Russia's case, as an illiberal democracy, they do seem to be doing those things. The Wagner Group is basically part of Vladimir Putin's overarching patronage network that helps maintain his power. And you might see this as a way of expanding his patronage network to include African heads of state. Most of the countries involved have been in Africa thus far. Or alternatively, you could view it as a way of basically just getting more resources with which to bolster his patronage network, kind of going overseas to import patronage capital, as it were. That's another way you can kind of frame it. Beyond that, though, there's not a lot of details, so it's kind of hard to say. Obviously, the whole operation is very cagey. They don't really do it very openly, and they're not very transparent about why they're doing it. But my impression thus far is that they're basically trading mercenaries for patronage capital. And that seems to be working relatively well. They seem to be making inroads into regions of Africa that have traditionally been in the French sphere of influence. And, that's the Francafrique we've talked about before. I think Burkina Faso and the Central African Republic are the two main examples I can think of as far as French zone of influence. But they've also started deploying to Chad more recently, sort of in response to the violence there. And I think they've also got a presence in Sudan. And they've also been working on a presence in Eritrea, although they've kind of gotten some pushback on that last one. And they're certainly bolstering ties with Egypt, but I think that's been more economic. I haven't really seen mention of mercenaries there. Although, to be fair, I definitely have heard of Russian mercenaries in Libya. So maybe that was the quid pro quo with Egypt. Egypt allows greater access to Egyptian resources for Wagner Group companies in exchange for Russian mercenaries in Libya. That would make sense to me anyway. But that's just conjecture on my part. Yeah, Russian influence seems to be expanding, but just not in a traditional way. It's not in a way that would kind of make, I think, Western countries worried too much, because it's not like the Russian military is deploying out and is using these places as like a strategic launching point for operations elsewhere. That's kind of what the United States has going on in West Africa, and certainly what the French have going on in West Africa. But the Russians, for now, have been restricting their operations purely to mercenary operations that have been tasked with very specific mission objectives, generally targeting rebels or whatnot.
So, I would like to increase my influence in this region. What ideas do you have? Well, we could send missionaries and share the word of God. No, too soft. We could send in the mercenaries. Oh, I like that.
Yeah, they've certainly made a lot of gains in that regard. I don't know how strategically valuable they are, but they definitely have a presence they didn't have before too. It's also interesting because one of the things that happened in the 1990s is that there was kind of an international consensus that mercenaries should not really be allowed to work for developing countries. I think there's still like some contractors that you can use, but like outright using mercenaries to fight in a civil war, for example, or suppress dissent, there was kind of a agreement that you shouldn't do those things. And so there was a number of South African mercenary groups that ended up having to kind of tone down their operations. I think Executive Outcomes is the famous one that I remember. I think they actually were used in the civil war in West Africa at one point. And it was partly their performance there that kind of led to that push to try to regulate that. So for a long time, that was kind of de facto honored, at least as far as I know. But now to see Russian mercenaries basically doing that same kind of work, that kind of says to me that international agreement is starting to weaken. So you may see a lot more mercenary action in Africa going forward on account of that. And not all of it necessarily Russian. It could be that the South Africans and other groups finally kind of return to form, as it were. I know that there's South African mercenaries who've been working for the Mozambique government to try to clamp down on the jihadi violence in the north of the country. But I think their usage has been relatively limited. I think they've been leaning more on the Wagner Group mercs thus far. I don't know if anybody cares about this, but if you want a quick breakdown of regional influence in Africa, China has. I'm speaking in terms of like competition for influence between like China, Europe, and the United States. Relatively speaking, China has the most influence in the south. France has the most influence in the west. East Africa is kind of balanced, so that's the most active area of competition right now between the West and China. And then North Africa is kind of more regional players. You know, regional players like Ethiopia, South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt are still very important in their own regions. So I'm not saying that China or the West is like has a monopoly on power in a region, but just in terms of relative influence between China and the West, that's roughly how the breakdown is. That's roughly how the influence breaks down. So just a quick trivia note there for anybody interested. Let's see, what else did we have here? Oh, I just had a quick note about inflation. Do you remember that big freeze in Texas recently?
Yep.
So that's apparently one of the contributing factors for the inflation. And apparently it significantly inhibited the supply of latex. And the reason that's important is because apparently that's an input in drywall, which I did not know. So of course there's a huge surge. There's been a huge surge in demand for housing, and housing markets have been doing very well. So there's a lot of construction. So there's in turn a lot of demand for construction materials like drywall. So the shutdown in latex production in Texas has been particularly damaging as far as helping cause inflation. So just some trivia there. I did not know that Texas produced latex, and I didn't know that it was an input in drywall. Let's see, what else did we have here? As far as U.S. politics, it's unlikely that the U.S. will be out of Afghanistan by the May 1st deadline, surprising nobody. But Biden did say that he can't picture troops being there in 2022, which suggests that he has a pretty hard deadline by the end of the year, at least, of getting U.S. troops out. So that kind of does give leverage to the Taliban a bit in negotiations, but I think that the United States is kind of willing to make the trade-off at this point. I think there's a much greater impetus on getting out of the conflict than there is in ensuring the continuity and stability of Afghanistan and the Afghan government. Excuse me. Let's see, there's another interesting thing there about Afghanistan. Besides the politics of negotiating some kind of peace agreement, there was something else. It slips my mind. Completely went out of my brain. It'll probably come back to me like 3 hours from now. Well, anyway, that's Afghanistan. And let's see, for the U.S. 2024 election, yeah, Biden said that it was his quote-unquote intention to run for re-election, which is purposely ambiguous language. You know, what I was reading is that he's kind of signaling that he might run, but that he doesn't want, well, he's signaling that he might not run for re-election, but he doesn't want potential candidates starting up their campaigns and distracting from the current policy agenda. You know, if he comes out and says that he's definitely not running, then there's going to be a whole bunch of people in the Democratic Party that basically just start up their campaign and start posturing, and it's going to throw off the whole equilibria right now. You know, right now the attention is firmly on getting legislation passed, but it could become much more about theater if people start politicking for the next election. So basically, he's still non-committal on that, most likely.
Look, I know I'm really old, And I said I wasn't going to run again, but let's just pretend that I'm going to run again, okay?
That Afghan thing is going to bug the hell out of me. Well, let's see. What else did we have here? Oh, that's right. I totally... Oh, man. How much time did we have?
15 minutes now?
I started at the bottom of the list, so I forgot the important stuff at the top. Oh. Okay, well, I had some more extensive notes about how the economic geography of the Middle East is changing. So I think that would be really cool to get into, but I guess we'll have to do it next time. Biden's potential trade policy for China is something I keep putting off. We'll probably have to save that for last time. Let's see, Russian influence? Oh, Belarus. I actually have time for this. So, we've talked before about the protests in Belarus, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so Belarus's foreign policy over the past couple decades has basically been to try to balance Russia with the West. The idea there is that, in general, they kind of favor Russia, but they don't want to be too dependent such that Russia could force them to do something they don't want. So the Belarusian government has kind of tried to avoid the worst excesses of authoritarianism. They kind of try to curb human rights abuses, at least publicly, so that they can stay in Europe's good graces and maintain some access to Europe's market and maintain some semblance of good relations. And again, they just do that so that if Russia does something they don't like, they can kind of use the West as a foil, basically. So that balance has basically been broken now as a result of the protests. My impression early on in the protests is that the Belarusian government was trying to maintain the balance between Russia and the West. But now recent events suggest that they're leaning much harder towards Russia. So it may be that there's some kind of formal political arrangement being negotiated between Russia and Belarus that will maybe ally them by treaty. They're already technically military allies, but basically there could be some kind of union in the cards. That's something that's been talked about for a couple decades, but nothing ever really came of it. But now there's actually more potential for that. The idea would basically be annexation. Belarus would become a part of Russia. How they do it could vary. It could be just outright annexation, or it could be something like a federal system where Belarus is technically still autonomous, but is otherwise a part of the overarching unification state, such as it were. Yeah, again, I'm not sure how exactly the details would work, but there's been some chatter to that effect. Basically, the reason that people are talking about it is because there's been some shifts in Belarus's foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia. They've got a couple things here. One, they've allowed what amounts to a de facto permanent Russian military presence in Belarus, which is not something they'd really done before. I say de facto because it comes in the form of rolling military exercises. They basically had almost continuous military exercises in Belarus over the past year or so. And, if they keep that up, then it basically amounts to a permanent presence. They can kind of hedge it by saying that they've never technically formally agreed to allow the Russians to stay permanently, but in effect they kind of are at this point. Let's see, they also signed a partnership agreement. It was a 5-year strategic partnership agreement that was the first of its kind signed between Belarus and Russia. There's not a lot of details about it, but the suspicion is that it solidifies the strategic alliance between the two and tightens it to a degree that was not really thought likely before. And also, the Belarusian government has agreed to an airbase. Not a Russian airbase, per se, but they've allowed the Russians to have access to a Belarusian airbase. So all of those changes basically point to a greater embrace of Russia on the part of the Belarusian government. And that suggests that Belarus is going to be working more closely strategically. Is going to work more closely with Russia on strategic matters going forward. So just to give an example, if things kick off with the Ukraine again in the future, and maybe that Belarus will much more actively assist Russia in handling the issue, whatever form it takes. As it was when Russia started its when the Ukrainian conflict started in 2014, Belarus largely tried to stay neutral. And that was actually something a lot of states allied with Russia did. A lot of states allied with Russia were not comfortable with Russia purposely interfering in the affairs of a neighboring state. And so kind of tried to hedge their bets a little bit by trying to tighten relations with the West. And Belarus was among them. So now, with the strategic shift happening, at least the perceived strategic shift happening, it seems Belarus will probably, instead of hedging relations with Russia in the future, they'll instead cooperate much more fully. So as far as the Ukraine issue, there's significant implications there, since the Ukraine has a significant border with Belarus. So there's a lot of potential there for the Russians to exploit that to their own advantage. Just a quick note on Belarus there. We did the political economy stuff. I thought we had more. I guess we didn't. Oh, the Egypt thing. Yeah, I was going to try to provide you a link for this, but I didn't have time for it. Do you remember hearing anything about pharaohs and the bodies thereof in Egypt being on parade?
No.
Okay, well, that's a thing that happened. Basically, I didn't read a whole lot about the story, but I saw a lot of pictures of it. The Egyptian government had this huge thing. I mean, I guess a media event is what you would call it. Yeah, basically the idea is that they were taking a lot of Egyptian artifacts that they had gotten back from overseas that that had been looted over time, including a number of mummified bodies of ancient Egyptian kings. And they had this big ceremony where they had all of them kind of carried into a museum or something. It was some kind of weird parade. But they spent a weirdly large amount of money on it. And it was like a big spectacle. You can kind of go online onto YouTube and you can see just how much pageantry was involved. Kind of a weird choice on the part of Cairo there. Not sure what they were going for. Maybe just kind of trying to distract people. Let's see, I think that's pretty much all we have time for. Probably. Yeah.
Have you ever played musical chairs?
I have.
That's
a long time
basically
ago.
I'm playing musical chairs right now.
Is that right?
Yes, anyone in the chat can confirm this is musical chairs.
Well, let me see. Maybe if you're doing that, then maybe I do have time for, let's do Syria. I think we might be able to squeeze that in. So let's see. So a quick Syria update. I have more details basically than the last time we talked about this. And in general, the strategic situation in Syria is still largely stagnant. But there have been a few localized moves that have the potential to become something later on. So one of them is that there's a new Kurdish militant group called the HET. And we don't know for sure, but the broad suspicion is that the YPG is supporting them. And it's a Kurdish militia in Afrin, which is basically a Kurdish enclave in western Syria. And they've been attacking, Turkish forces, actually, in the area. Not only actual Turkish military, but also the FSA. And that could be a problem in future, because, Turkey already has pretty bad relations with the YPG. But it's also bad news because the YPG is specifically supported by the United States. So if the YPG goes around killing Turkish troops, then that's going to come back and affect Turkish-American relations. So I suspect the United States is going to probably apply some pressure for the YPG not to do that. But I imagine the YPG will probably deny the culpability, basically. I suspect the reason that they've been cagey about how much support they're giving to the HET is specifically because they want to avoid embarrassing the United States and putting the United States in a position where they have to force them to stop supporting them. Turkey, for its part, is not going to be happy about it. The Kurdish militancy of any time pretty much sets off Ankara. But I'm not sure how much of that wrath is going to be directed at Afrin as opposed to how much is going to be directed at Washington. So that's a space to watch going forward. We'll see how the diplomatic fallout of that pans out. Let's see. So other than Afrin, there was also some violence in Kamachili, which is way in northeastern Syria. It's like a town up there where Kamachili is weird because it's one of those areas that the government held on to through the Civil War. It's basically like a little enclave that they keep supplied by way of an airport that they control in the city. Around the city, around that territory of government control, they're almost completely surrounded by Kurds, although more recently there's been more Turkish activity. But the violence in this case has been between YPG forces and regime forces, unsurprisingly. It's a little weird in the sense that for almost the entirety of the Syrian civil war, Kurdish forces and government forces have not fought each other. Almost all of the violence has been between government forces and rebel forces, either in Idlib or in Daraa, basically northwestern or southwestern Syria, respectively. But in the northeast and eastern Syria, the Kurds were kind of left on their own, and they basically just started governing themselves in the absence of any state authority. But they didn't actually fight the state authorities who were there, which is why the government was able to hang on to this enclave in Kamashili. The bigger problem for the Kurds out east was the Islamic State, and I think everybody's pretty familiar with that timeline.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that the Kurds are starting to fight a little bit with, the fact that the Kurds are clashing with government forces up there, it's a little strange, and I can't really explain it, and it has me thinking that maybe there's some change in government strategy there. One of the things that the Russians have been trying to do lately is to try to get the Turks to allow them access to the regions that they control. The idea is to have joint Turkish-Russian patrols in these sort of disputed areas. And so this could be an effort on the part of Damascus, on the part of the Syrian government, to try to pressure the Kurds and the Kurds specifically to allow Russian patrols in the area. And there were last year some clashes between American patrols and Russian patrols, not far away. Nothing too serious, basically just ramming each other for some reason. I don't know specifically why, but yeah, they just kind of rammed each other's patrol vehicles for a while there. So this could just be about the Russians wanting greater access and influence. That would benefit Damascus, since obviously they're allied pretty closely with the Russians. Apparently, Russian military police were deployed eventually. Let's see. And the clashes have halted, so that may have had something to do with it, but it could have also have just been an excuse to deploy Russian personnel. Let's see. There was also some Russian gunships that were deployed. That probably didn't hurt. Let's see. Yeah, that's the gist of it. So I don't doubt that the Russians would like a greater presence in the region, just because that gives them more leverage vis-a-vis whatever eventual peace deal is eventually negotiated between all the different relevant parties. But the Turks have been pretty hesitant thus far. And I'm not sure what they hope to gain by leaning on the Kurds, since the Kurds already have the US backing them. So it may not be about wanting access to Kurdish territory so much as pressuring the United States. It may even just be the Russians trying to feel out American commitment to the region, in which case it's more shit testing than anything. Anybody's guess. Let's see, there was also an oil deal agreed between the government and the Kurds. Yeah, they're willing to cooperate, but this isn't really a political agreement. This is actually an economic agreement. And this kind of goes back to what I mentioned before about how economic interests trump political interests frequently. So let's see, there's border crossings between Kurdish territory and government territory, and basically the government will strategically open or close those depending on whatever negotiation they're having with the Kurdish authorities. In this case, the agreement had to do with oil. So basically, oil tankers will be allowed to run from Kurdish territory to government territory. And the crux of the deal is, basically it benefits both sides. The SDF, that is to say the Kurdish authorities out east, they need oil revenue and food. The money speaks for itself. They just need money for a government to subsidize consumption. I shouldn't say subsidize consumption. There are food shortages out there, as well as shortages of other goods, and there's also services that provide important support to people who have been dislocated from all the fighting that's been happening. And they just don't have those resources to fund those programs. So oil revenue is pretty important for the Kurds at this point. So they need the money for that reason. They also need food because they just they can't grow enough to feed the population there, and they need to buy it from somebody. And it's easiest to buy it just from Western Syria, basically. And as it happens, the Kurds actually prefer dealing with the government when it comes to oil because they actually have monopsonic power. There's a whole bunch of sanctions against the Syrian government. So the Syrian government has a very difficult time finding willing oil sellers. The Kurds, in contrast, are quite happy to sell to them. And so because they're the only ones who are pretty much willing to do that, they can charge much higher prices. So they actually get pretty good deals when they can get them. So the SDF gets revenue and food. Since the government is opening up checkpoints and allowing more trade to flow through, the government, for its part, gets oil, which it really badly needs. Because, again, they can't buy oil from anywhere else. And oil is a pretty important input for a number of industries in Syria. Agriculture, in particular, is sensitive because they have a harvest coming up and they don't actually have enough oil. Specifically, they don't have enough fuel in order to fuel the tractors to kind of do the harvest, basically, to harvest the food out of the ground. The Caesar Act actually made the situation worse. The Caesar Act is some American legislation that puts sanctions on people committing human rights abuses, and specifically it is targeted at people, generally anyway. I hope I'm getting that right. Please correct me if I'm mischaracterizing it there. But the effect of the Caesar Act was to make the oil shortages worse. And broad swaths of Syrian industry are paralyzed as a result. So there's a huge demand from Syrian industry for oil, and therefore a huge impetus on the part of the Syrian government to reach some kind of oil deal here. It's also worth mentioning that this deal is not going to actually solve the shortages. It's just going to ease them. They're still going to hurt for lack of oil, but it'll help at least.
So Chad wanted a quick explanation for what is monoscopic power. Is that the term?
Oh, monopsonic power.
Monopsonic power.
It's the flip side of like a monopoly. Like a monopoly is when you only have one seller in a market, and they abuse, well, maybe not abuse, they exploit their power as the single seller to charge higher prices. So they can buy more stuff. I guess in the case, this would actually be monopolistic power, wouldn't it? So I guess I used the term wrong. Yeah, because they're selling oil, so they would have monopolistic power, not monopsonic power. My apologies.
They're the only buyer.
Yeah, monopsonic power would be they're the only buyer. So if there's only one buyer in a market, then there is a monopsony. Sorry. So in that case, the buyer can leverage their status as the only buyer to get cheaper prices.
Nice.
So got my wires crossed. I said monopsonic when I should have said monopolistic. My apologies.
Everyone saw that word and they were like, shit, that wasn't on the SAT.
No, that's my fault. My brain doesn't cooperate sometimes.
So say we all.
Just to kind of finish off this point here, another factor in the negotiations that happened between the Kurds and the Syrian government also relates to the Russian government and the Turkish government. So the most recent deal for oil actually, the Kurds had less leverage in the recent oil deal than they had before in previous deals. And that was because the Turks and Russians had managed to get the Syrian government to agree to open up crossing points between rebel-held territory in the north and government-held territory in the rest of Syria. So that makes it a little easier for them to get access to oil. So that's also a factor at play here. Basically, anything that involves easing the transit of goods and services is going to help out the Syrian government at this point.
Cool. We're at a reasonable stopping point. Seems like we have a nice Southeast Asia title for the episode as one of the main regions that we hit. If you have any thoughts about this episode, maybe you joined late, you have questions, you can put your question in the comments of the YouTube VOD of this and we can pass those along, or you can just read them. He's not reading the chat through this, but if you're here for the first half, I would say to 2/3 of the Agent Smith time, and you put a question in the chat, that'll usually get passed along in the Discord. So you can be a part of the conversation and also correct us when we say stuff the wrong way.
Yep.
Well,
oh,
cool.
Shit. Do we have time for flags real quick?
Yes, sire, you may do the flags.
Oh, I always get roped into this. Well, I wrote myself into it. So we had somebody from Taiwan watching, or somebody in Taiwan watching. So hello to Mr. Taiwan. I don't think we've had many Taiwan flags on here lately. Let's see. There's Mr. Oh, Bosnia. I think that's the first time I've seen a Bosnia flag. Yeah, whoever we have in Bosnia watching, let us know what's going on in Bosnia. You don't have to write a paragraph, just like in general. What's the top news item in Bosnia right now? Netherlands, yeah, usual suspects otherwise, it looks like. Mr. Curacao is gone. I guess he's busy. Let's see, there's Estonia, Belarus. That Belarus flag still throws me. Somebody was saying that it might be a VPN.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that. Austria to Brazil. Brazil's a pretty exciting place to live in right now. Good luck, guys.
Hang in there, team.
And then we have 6 from Australia. Leave your desks alone, guys. That's not what they're for.
Yeah, that's gross, guys. Let's be professional.
All right. Thank you for indulging me.
No problem. We got a pretty cool international audience. We have a lot of people here tonight, so I don't know if it shows like every single viewer. 600 viewers. People like listening to you, dude.
Oh, well, thank you. Hopefully I can get better in the future so it's a little less discombobulated.
It's always going to be kind of scuffed. That's one of the beautiful things about content. I think it adds a lot of... it humanizes it. That's one of the things that I tell myself when I deliver something that's kind of messed up. Like maybe I made a guide or video, but I was sniffling a little bit because I had too much spicy in my food. That's part of the story of what happened in that video, and I could do a retake of it, but ain't nobody got time for that.
Yeah, I sympathize. But thank you for having me on again. It's always a privilege. Thank you very much.
Good to have you, sir. And thank you, chat, for being pleasant and providing lots of fun questions and conversations. Thank you, Sea of Whiskey, for handling these questions and passing them along to Agent Smith, and Cobra X for shipping these out to YouTube super fast.
Thank you much.
Appreciate you, fam. Have a good rest of your week, sir. And we will see you on the next episode of World Discussion with Agent Smith.
Yep. See you next time. Have a good night.
GG.